After he sold his car to pay for her surgery, Noah Bennett thought he was proving that love still meant sacrifice. That a husband's devotion was measured not by money, but by how far he'd go to save the woman he loved. He gave up his pride, his comfort, and the last thing he owned of value just to keep Savannah alive. But when she recovered, the woman he saved looked into the eyes of the man who sold his car for her and said she'd rather kiss a dog than him. Those words didn't just break his heart. They woke something far colder inside him, something even she didn't know existed. Why would a wife humiliate the man who sold everything to save her life? What secret could turn a grateful woman into a stranger overnight? And what did Noah do next that shattered her world beyond repair? The rain had not stopped for 2 days straight, turning Atlanta's gray skyline into a wash of silver reflections. Inside the small apartment, Noah Bennett sat by the window, staring at the one possession he had sworn never to sell, his silver Tesla Model S. He had spent 6 years paying for it, restoring it, polishing it every Saturday morning. To him, that car wasn't metal and glass. It was the story of every overtime shift, every canceled weekend, every silent prayer he'd whispered beside Savannah's hospital bed. Now he had to sell it to save her life. Savannah lay in that same hospital bed across town, hooked to monitors, pale and fragile after the diagnosis that changed everything. A rare heart valve condition requiring immediate surgery. The insurance company had refused coverage because of a lapse in premium payment. The surgery deposit was $74,000, and Noah's savings had been drained by medical bills and the children's school fees. The only asset left was the Tesla. He dialed the buyer, a man from an online ad who'd offered cash. "Yeah, I'll take it today," Noah said quietly, his voice breaking in the middle. The buyer arrived an hour later, crisp suit, impatient tone, carrying a banker's envelope. The transaction took 12 minutes. When the car drove off, Noah stood barefoot in the rain, watching the red taillights fade until they became just another pair of blurred city lights. That night he sat beside Savannah in the ICU, his clothes still damp, hair disheveled. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she whispered weakly, "Did you get the money?" He nodded, brushing her hair back. "Yes, baby, the surgery's covered." She exhaled a long, shaky breath, not of gratitude but of relief. "Good," she murmured before drifting off again. Noah forced a smile through his exhaustion. He had imagined that moment would bring them closer, that she'd see the depth of his devotion. Instead, her tone had carried something hollow, distant, like a woman ticking a box. Over the next days, Noah became a ghost in the hospital corridors, sleeping on chairs, skipping meals, handling paperwork, taking calls from bill collectors. Emily, his sister, visited once and said, "You look like hell, Noah. Are you sure she even notices what you're doing?" He smiled faintly. "She will when she gets better." When the surgery ended successfully, Noah wept. He kissed Savannah's forehead, whispering, "You're going to be okay." She opened her eyes, saw him, and for a fleeting second smiled. But then, even in her weakened state, she asked, "Did they give you a receipt for the surgery deposit? I don't want confusion later." The nurse glanced at Noah, confused. He only nodded again, too tired to be hurt. Back at home a week later, Noah stood in the empty driveway where the Tesla had always gleamed. The kids, Ethan, Lily, and Grace, were chasing bubbles in the yard, laughter echoing through the rain. Savannah, recovering in a recliner, scrolled through her phone, posting a filtered hospital photo captioned, "Grateful to God for a second chance." She didn't tag Noah. That night, as he made soup and laid her medication beside the bed, she said almost absently, "You'll need to start taking the bus to work, right?" He smiled gently. "Yeah, it's fine. It's just for a while." She shrugged, eyes never leaving her phone. "Well, maybe it's time you focused on getting promoted instead of wasting time fixing people's engines." Her words cut deeper than the rain outside, but he said nothing. Love, he told himself, required endurance. What he didn't know, what none of his quiet prayers could anticipate, was that this act of kindness would become the fuse for an explosion that would destroy everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and family. Because while he was selling his car to save her life, She was already planning to give her heart to another man. Perfect. I'll handle scene 2 with realistic, cinematic slow burn psychology, showing Savannah's emotional detachment and subtle behavioral clues that slowly reveal infidelity. It will feel 100% real, like something that could actually happen in any modern American marriage. Let's continue seamlessly. The following weeks after Savannah's surgery blurred into a fragile calm that only Noah believed was healing. He woke before dawn to prepare breakfast, packed the kids' lunches, checked Savannah's medication schedule, and still made it to work before 8. The house smelled of disinfectant and lavender candles, a reminder that their lives were under reconstruction. But beneath the surface, something inside her had changed. Something sharp and cold that no doctor could repair. Savannah moved slower now, but her mind seemed to race elsewhere. She spent long hours on her phone, scrolling endlessly through social feeds and private chats. The first time Noah noticed, she was sitting by the window at dusk, her reflection lit by her screen. "Who are you texting?" he asked lightly. She didn't look up. "Just Madison. She's checking in." Madison Lawson, Trent's wife. That answer disarmed him. He smiled faintly. "Tell her I said thanks." Savannah only nodded and kept typing. At dinner, she no longer asked about his day. Her responses were reduced to hums, nods, or distracted half-smiles. Sometimes she'd look at him as if he were a stranger who'd wandered into her home by mistake. When he reached for her hand one night, she flinched. Not out of pain, but instinct, as if affection had become foreign. Emily noticed it before he did. During a visit one Sunday, she leaned close and whispered in the kitchen, "Noah, she talks to you like you're a tenant, not her husband." He forced a laugh. "She's just recovering. Surgery changes people." Emily's eyes softened. "Maybe, but recovery shouldn't erase love." The next morning, Noah left early for a meeting at the auto design firm where he worked. His bus ride was long and crowded, but he didn't mind. He used the time to plan how to surprise Savannah with a new laptop she'd been wanting. When he returned that evening, the kids were upstairs watching cartoons. Savannah was in the living room, hair done, makeup subtle but deliberate, dressed too nicely for a weekday. Her phone lit up on the coffee table. Incoming call, Trent Lawson. For a moment, Noah froze. Savannah's eyes flicked to the phone, then to him. "It's just business," she said quickly, picking it up before he could speak. She stepped into the hallway, voice low, tone soft. "Yes, I got your message. I'll see you Friday." Noah stood there, every sound in the house amplified. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the wall clock, the faint laughter of the kids upstairs. Friday. He tried to convince himself it was harmless, that maybe Trent was helping her with the charity event she'd mentioned, but something in her voice told him otherwise. It wasn't the words. It was the tone, that warmth she hadn't used with him in months. That night, Savannah climbed into bed facing the wall. Noah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every detail. The call, the outfit, the soft smile that wasn't his. For the first time, doubt crept in, quiet but corrosive. 2 days later, she told him she'd be attending a wellness retreat with friends for the weekend. She left in a white Lexus that Noah didn't recognize. He waved from the doorway, pretending not to notice the expensive gold bracelet gleaming on her wrist, something he hadn't bought her. Saturday night, he received a call from Emily. "Noah, are you home?" "Yeah, why?" "I just saw Savannah at the Westlake Hotel. She wasn't with any friends." His heart stopped. "Who was she with?" Emily hesitated. "Trent." The phone slipped from his hand. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was confirmation of something he'd already felt deep in his bones. He walked to the living room window, the streetlight spilling pale gold over the empty driveway where his Tesla once stood. The irony hit hard. He had sold his car to save her life, and she had driven away in another man's. Upstairs, the kids slept peacefully. Downstairs, Noah stood in the dark, replaying every choice, every sacrifice, every lie he hadn't wanted to see. He told himself maybe there was an explanation. Maybe Trent was just helping. Maybe Savannah would walk through that door and tell him he was wrong. But he knew, and that knowing quiet and sharp, was the moment something inside him shifted. Not anger, not yet, just awareness, the kind that waits, watches, and plans. The next morning, Noah sat at the kitchen table long after the coffee had gone cold. Savannah's laughter drifted from upstairs, soft, rehearsed, the kind that used to belong to him. He stared at her phone resting on the counter, its cracked corner screen lighting up every few seconds with muted notifications. He wasn't a man who checked his wife's phone. He still believed in trust, even when trust had started to rot. But when the device buzzed again and the name Trent Lawson appeared across the glass, his hands moved before his heart could stop him. The message was short. Can't stop thinking about Friday. Same hotel next week? He stared at it until the words blurred. His first instinct was denial. Maybe it was a business trip. Maybe Trent's wife Madison was there. Maybe, but he stopped. There was no maybe. His pulse hammered as the realization sank in. The woman he'd sold his car to save had sold her loyalty for pleasure. When Savannah entered the kitchen, he set the phone back exactly where it was and forced a smile. "Morning," he said, voice calm. She returned the smile, radiant, unbothered. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep." "You worry too much," she said, brushing past him to pour herself coffee. "Everything's fine." Everything was not fine. Everything was breaking. That evening, Noah visited his sister. Emily saw the tension written across his face. "What happened?" she asked. He shook his head. "I think she's seeing someone." Emily froze. "Who?" He hesitated. "Trent Lawson." Her expression hardened. "The same man who tried to buy your designs last year? The one you called your friend?" Noah nodded slowly. "I think it's been going on longer than I realized." Emily's voice dropped. "You need to know for sure before you act. Don't accuse her without proof." Her words echoed through his mind that night as he sat alone in the living room. The air was thick with the scent of Savannah's perfume. Floral, expensive, unfamiliar. On the mantel, a family photo captured their wedding day. Savannah smiling wide, his arm around her waist, the world ahead of them. He took the frame down and studied it, tracing the edge of her frozen smile. Somewhere between that picture and now, she had chosen another life. The next weekend, Savannah claimed she was attending another wellness retreat. This time, Noah followed. He borrowed Emily's car, parked near the Westlake Hotel, and watched from across the street. The night air carried the faint hum of city life. Engines, laughter, rain. But his focus was fixed on the entrance. At exactly 8:17 p.m., Savannah appeared. She was radiant in a black dress, hair curled, a gold chain catching the glow of the streetlight. A moment later, Trent pulled up in his white Jaguar. He stepped out, adjusted his jacket, and leaned in to kiss her. It wasn't a friendly peck. It was the kind of kiss that belonged to secrets. Noah's fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't take pictures. He didn't honk. He didn't confront. He simply watched until the hotel doors swallowed them both. The rain started again, blurring the windshield, the city, and everything he thought he knew about love. When he returned home that night, the kids were asleep. Their small backpacks hung by the door, school drawings pinned to the fridge, the illusion of a perfect family. He sat on the couch and stared into the dark, his heartbeat slow, deliberate, cold. He wasn't the kind of man who screamed or threw things. His pain didn't explode. It solidified like steel cooled in silence. Upstairs, Savannah's suitcase waited for unpacking, her perfume clinging to the hallway air. Noah looked at it and finally whispered to himself, "Not yet." He needed proof, evidence, timing, precision. He needed to move like an engineer, carefully, quietly, calculating each step. Because kindness had made him blind once, but betrayal had just given him sight. And from that night forward, Noah Bennett stopped being the man who sold his car to save his wife. He became the man who would destroy her with the same calm he once loved her with. By Monday morning, Noah moved through the house like a man wearing a mask. Quiet, deliberate, unreadable. Savannah noticed the change but couldn't name it. He still made breakfast for the kids, still folded her robe neatly on the bed, still kissed her forehead before leaving for work. But something behind his eyes had changed. The softness had been replaced by stillness, the kind that comes right before a storm. At the office, Noah's mind wasn't on the engine designs glowing on his computer screen. It was on Friday night. The black dress, the kiss, the hotel doors closing. Every time he blinked, he saw it again. He'd once believed love was an investment, that if you gave enough, it multiplied. But now he saw what it really was, a gamble where only one person ever knew the odds. During lunch, he called an old friend, Logan Pierce, a retired detective who now worked as a private investigator. "Logan, I need your help," Noah said, voice low. "What kind of help?" "I need to know the truth," Noah replied, "and I need it done quietly." Logan didn't ask for details. "Send me her schedule. I'll start tonight." That evening, Savannah came home later than usual. She smelled faintly of expensive cologne that wasn't his. "Sorry, traffic," she said casually, placing her purse on the counter. Noah smiled faintly. "Everything okay?" "Of course," she said. "Why wouldn't it be?" He nodded and went back to stirring dinner. The act was so calm that she didn't notice the way his eyes no longer followed her with affection, only calculation. 2 days later, Logan texted a single line. "You were right." Attached were photos. Savannah and Trent at a rooftop restaurant, laughing, hands intertwined, faces close in candlelight. Another picture showed them checking into the Westlake again. Noah stared at the images until his eyes burned. Then he forwarded one to himself, printed it, folded it neatly, and slid it into his wallet. Proof. The next morning, Savannah served herself coffee, humming softly, unaware that her husband now carried the evidence of her betrayal inches from her hand. She looked beautiful, effortless, poised, the kind of woman people admired from a distance. To anyone else, she looked like a wife worth dying for. To Noah, she now looked like a stranger who had taken everything he had and smiled while doing it. When he went to work, he didn't drive. He walked. The air was cold, the streets damp from early rain. His reflection in a storefront window caught him off guard. The same man, but older now, sharper. The version of himself Savannah had created through her lies. He walked into a bank, met with an attorney, and began to move everything, savings, shares, even old patents, into a trust she couldn't touch. That night when Savannah climbed into bed, Noah whispered softly, "Do you love me?" Her answer came too easily. "Of course I do. Why would you ask that?" He studied her face, her practiced expression. "No reason," he said. She rolled away, falling asleep without a second thought. Noah lay there staring into the darkness, his mind piecing together a new design. Not for an engine this time, but for revenge. He would not confront her yet. He would not rage or weep. He would rebuild his world in silence, make her believe she'd won. And when her guard was down, when she thought she had taken everything, that would be the moment she'd realize she had only borrowed time, because kindness had cost him everything. Now it was time for precision to cost her more. He kept moving forward the way a man rewires a broken engine, methodical, exact, patient. The photos Logan sent were small and grainy at first glance, but they were enough to map the pattern. The dinners, the hotel check-ins, the same white Jaguar pulling up at the Westlake. Logan kept digging. He found receipts, a pattern of transfers from a shell account that paid for rooms and gifts, and a series of anonymous messages to Savannah's phone the night before she said she'd rather kiss a dog than him. Noah read every line with the calm of a man cataloging every part he'd need to dismantle a machine. He hired an attorney that week, Claire Stanton, a quiet woman with a reputation for dismantling lies and building cases where others saw only grief. She listened without interrupting as Noah told the story. The sale of the Tesla, the surgery, the hotel, the photos. When he finished, she pulled a small notebook across the table and wrote 3 words: evidence, timing, custody. "We move slow and we move smart," she said. "You don't want a courtroom meltdown. You want a conviction of fact. You want the truth to look inevitable." They began by quietly protecting what Noah still had left. The small patents in his name, the modest savings tucked into a dying 401k, the design files he'd created for a startup he'd once believed would be their future. Claire arranged for a confidentiality hold on certain assets and advised him to avoid any public outbursts. "She'll wait for you to break," she said. "Don't let her have the spectacle." Noah took her advice like a manifest. He learned the rhythms of patience. Arriving late to nights she planned, keeping dinners quiet and ordinary, letting her think he remained blind. At home he continued to fold her robe, to kiss her forehead when the children slept, to answer school emails and field parent-teacher calls. To the rest of the world, he was the same man who had sold his car to save his wife. But when he was alone, he revised lists, drafted subpoenas in his head, worked out custody scenarios until each possibility had been stress-tested. The night she humiliated him in the way that would become the story people repeated, on the evening he finally decided he had enough, arrived like any other Tuesday. The kids had been tucked into bed by Emily after she volunteered to stay over. Savannah had an event at the charity Trent's firm hosted, where she wore the same bright smile she used for photo ops. Noah waited up, making tea, rehearsing what he would not say. When she returned past midnight, she slid inside like someone who just passed through an ancestral hall of admirers. Beautiful, inconspicuous, satisfied. He could smell the cologne on her coat. He had the photos in his wallet and the attorney's plan in his head, but at that moment, he wanted something softer. He wanted to understand. "How was it?" he asked, voice low. She dropped her bag, shrugged off a shrug. "Fine. Trent's people were generous." The tone was casual, practiced, uninterested. She sat at the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone. He sat next to her and waited for whatever remained of the woman he married to look at him. Instead, she did something he had not expected. She laughed, a short, brittle sound, and for a second he thought it was at something on the phone. Then she turned to him with a face that was almost cruel in its civility. "Noah," she said, and the way she said his name felt like a foreign language she used for servants. "I don't know why you made that big deal selling the car. It was sweet, I guess, but I can't help being honest." He eased the photograph of her and Trent into the inside pocket of his shirt. "Honest how?" She shrugged as if air itself could explain. Sometimes I think you need to stop living in second-class thinking. You sold a car, and you look like a hero, but I'd rather kiss a dog than kiss the version of you that thinks that's enough. Her mouth shaped the words like a ceremonial blade. "I can't be with a man who plays at generosity when he could be ambitious." The room tilted. For a beat, he saw only the children's faces asleep in their beds, the wedding photo in the frame, the small rituals of a life he had been building. Then the words landed and echoed, cruel and precise. He felt the familiar shove of shame, the animal sting, but it didn't erupt. Instead, something steelier and older settled into his chest, an acceptance that the transaction had been made, and that from now on he would not be a casualty of it. He could have risen, grabbed her, screamed the truth. He could have ripped her off the bed and demanded explanations, DNA tests, confessions. Instead, he reached for the kettle and poured more tea, as if making bedtime for the injured could erase the blow. "Okay," he said softly. "Sleep well." Her eyes flicked toward him, bemused. Are you serious? You're not angry?" Her disbelief was a dagger. He smiled the smallest possible smile. "I'm tired," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow." He watched her go to the bathroom, watched the water in her glass tremble like a heart. When she left the room, he stood and opened the drawer where he kept the photos Logan had taken. He slid them into an envelope and sealed it with his thumb. On it he wrote in blocky letters, "Do not open. Evidence." The next morning he called Claire and read her the exact words she had used. "She said she'd rather kiss a dog than me," he told the attorney, and for the first time his voice held a new, flat note, one that did not plead but cataloged. Claire's reply was immediate and businesslike. "We have motive, Noah. We have humiliation. We have emotional damage being used against you already. We'll start the custody petitions quietly. We'll file for an independent DNA test for the children as part of the discovery. You need to be ready for the fallout." He was ready in a way he had never been before. He had once measured love in the currency of selflessness. Now he would measure justice in documents and depots. He called Logan, asked for discreet surveillance of Trent's accounts, and arranged for a forensic accountant to look into the shell payments. Each piece of the plan clicked into place like a well-oiled mechanism. At noon, Savannah posted a photo on social media, a smiling selfie with a caption about new horizons. Comments poured in with hearts and praise. Noah stared at the screen for a long time, then closed his laptop. He had an appointment with the family court the following week to file the first papers. He thought of the Tesla pulling away in the rain, its taillights disappearing into night. He pictured, not the car, but the moment a circuit completes and the engine starts again, powerful, inexorable, and ready to move. He would not break her with loud flares. He would dismantle the comfortable life she'd built from lies, piece by piece, until public humiliation was only the final, inevitable notice, an ending that matched the way she had begun, by choosing herself over everyone else. The morning light slipped through the curtains in thin gold lines, falling across Noah's face as he sat at the dining table, motionless. The kids were still asleep upstairs, the quiet hum of cartoons playing from their tablets the only sound in the house. Across from him, Savannah sipped her coffee, the faint scent of another man's cologne clinging to her robe. Her phone vibrated. She glanced at it, smiled slightly, and turned it face down. That small motion, the casual, effortless secrecy, burned deeper than any argument ever could. Noah had built this home with love, patience, and quiet faith. Yet here he was, a stranger in his own marriage, watching the woman he'd saved text the man who had ruined them. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Silence had become his shield. When she finally rose from her chair, she said over her shoulder, "I might go out tonight. Don't wait up." He nodded. "Drive safe." The moment the door closed, Noah's entire posture changed. The mask of calm dropped, and the calculating precision of an engineer took its place. He pulled out a slim folder from the drawer, one that now held everything Logan had uncovered. Hotel receipts, photographs, financial transfers, text logs, even voice recordings. Each piece was a gear in the machine of her downfall. He had stayed quiet because he wanted her to think she was safe. People confessed their sins when they believed they'd won. And Savannah had been parading her victory in front of him for weeks. That afternoon, Noah met with Claire Stanton again. She was crisp, deliberate, and sharp-eyed. "Are you certain about the children?" she asked quietly, sliding the paternity request form across the table. Noah's fingers tightened around the pen. "I need to be," he said. "If I'm wrong, I'll apologize to the world. If I'm right, she'll lose everything." Claire studied him. "You've changed since last week." He met her gaze. "Last week I was hurt. Now I'm awake." They filed the petition under confidentiality clauses. The DNA kits were to be collected discreetly through medical proxies, so Savannah wouldn't know until the results were final. In parallel, Claire began mapping out the divorce filings, emotional cruelty, adultery, financial misconduct. Every move was calculated. Every sentence was written to pierce, not bleed. Meanwhile, Noah carried on like nothing had changed. He drove the children to school in Emily's old SUV, packed lunches, smiled at teachers, attended PTA meetings. To the world, he was the devoted husband of a recovering wife. To Savannah, he was the quiet fool still grateful to have her alive. On a rainy Friday night, she came home late again, pretending to yawn. "You're still awake?" He looked up from his laptop. "Just working." She walked past him and poured herself a glass of wine. "You should sleep more, Noah. You look tired." He smiled faintly. "So do you." She gave him a quick glance, suspicious, fleeting, but brushed it off and went upstairs. The moment she was gone, Noah opened the email from the lab. His hand trembled once, just once, as he clicked the document. 3 names, 3 results, 3 words repeated under each. Not the father. For several minutes, he didn't breathe. The world went silent, except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. He read it again, line by line, until his chest felt hollow. Ethan, Lily, Grace. None of them were his. The faces he had kissed goodnight, the voices that had called him dad, all born from another man's betrayal. When he finally stood, the paper was crumpled in his fist, the veins in his forearm visible under the lamplight. He walked into the children's room, They slept peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering just outside their dreams. He looked at them, not with hatred, but with a grief so deep it was beyond tears. Then he whispered softly, "None of this was your fault." Downstairs, his phone buzzed again. A message from Trent. "She's asleep yet?" Followed by a winking emoji. Noah's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of pain, but of resolve. He finally understood the equation of betrayal. Every lie had a cost. Every act of cruelty had an invoice waiting at the end. He texted Logan one sentence. "It's time." By morning, Logan had already begun. Hidden cameras from hotel corridors, credit card statements traced through shell companies, photos sent to Madison Lawson, Trent's wife. Within 48 hours, the man Savannah worshipped would wake up to his entire world collapsing. Noah didn't rage. He didn't mourn. He simply waited for gravity to do what it always did. Pull the truth down to the surface. And when it finally landed, it would bury them both. By the end of that week, the first domino fell. Trent Lawson's face appeared on the morning news, a headline scrolling beneath his photo. Atlanta investor under federal investigation for embezzlement and fraud. His own employees had leaked financial evidence. Evidence that had mysteriously found its way to the state attorney's office overnight. What neither Trent nor Savannah knew was that the documents came from a USB drive Noah had mailed anonymously 2 days earlier. The same USB he'd pulled from Trent's office server during one of his late-night visits. An access granted months ago when he'd helped Trent debug his company software as a friend. Now that friendship was a noose. Savannah was still asleep when Noah turned off the TV. He sat quietly, the mug in his hand trembling slightly as the realization of his own strategy began to settle in. Revenge wasn't about noise. It was about precision and the patience to let guilt rot from the inside before the world saw the smoke. By noon, the news was everywhere. Trent's assets were frozen. Reporters waited outside his firm's building. His wife, Madison Lawson, went silent for an entire day before posting one sentence online. "Sometimes karma doesn't knock. It kicks the door down." Savannah saw the post that evening. She gasped softly, scrolling through the article, her hand covering her mouth. "Oh my God! Trent's being investigated," she whispered, her voice cracked with fear, not grief. "They're saying millions went missing. Can you believe that?" Noah looked up from his laptop, calm, almost detached. "People always get caught eventually." She blinked. "Do you think he'll be okay?" He shrugged. "Does it matter?" The simplicity of his tone made her look at him differently, like she was seeing a version of her husband she hadn't met before. For years, she'd mistaken his silence for weakness, his kindness for naivety. But now, as he held her gaze, something in his eyes made her shiver. There was no pleading, no heartbreak, just a calm knowing. 2 nights later, Logan called. "He's broken, Noah. The guy's talking to federal agents, trying to shift blame to someone else. Guess who he's naming?" Noah's lips curved slightly. "Savannah." "Exactly." Logan paused. "You sure you want to go through with the next step? This will destroy her publicly." Noah's voice didn't waver. "Logan, she destroyed me privately. I'm just returning balance." The following week, Claire filed the official divorce motion, citing adultery, financial deceit, and emotional cruelty. A private DNA report was attached under sealed evidence. Savannah was served the papers at home, barefoot, wearing Noah's old hoodie. When she saw the envelope, she frowned. "What's this?" "Read it," he said. Her eyes moved down the page. As the words "petition for divorce" came into focus, her face drained of color. "Noah, what is this? Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer. She flipped to the second page, the attached lab results. Her fingers shook. The color left her entirely. "You had them tested," she whispered. "You? How could you?" He met her eyes, steady, unflinching. "How could you?" The sound she made wasn't a cry. It was a gasp, an unpracticed breath of someone realizing the mask was gone. "Noah, please. The kids, they're not mine." Her knees buckled. The papers slipped from her hands and scattered across the floor like broken glass. He walked past her, calm, deliberate, as she fell to her knees trying to gather them. You can explain, she begged. We can talk. I was confused. I was scared. He stopped at the door. You were greedy, he said softly. You wanted a better man. Now you have none. The next morning, reporters camped outside their gate. The story had leaked. Trent Lawson's mistress under investigation for aiding financial fraud. Madison had sent everything to the press, along with the photos Noah had quietly provided. By afternoon, Savannah's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. Brands she worked with cut ties. Her social accounts flooded with comments. Madison's final blow was poetic. A single photo of Savannah in Trent's arms at the hotel, captioned, "She kissed the man who stole millions, and the husband who sold his car to save her." That night, Noah watched it all unfold in silence. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. Revenge didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure, a quiet, precise balancing of the scales. When Savannah finally returned home, makeup streaked, voice trembling, she dropped to her knees before him. "Noah, please, I have nothing left. I lost everything." He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "So did I," he said simply. She reached for his hand, but he stepped back. "You told me you'd rather kiss a dog than me," he whispered. "Now you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you'd never open your mouth." The door closed behind him as he walked away. Outside, the rain began again. Soft, steady, cleansing. For the first time in a year, Noah felt air fill his lungs without heaviness. He called Claire that night. "Everything's over," he said. Her voice was gentle. "Not everything. Some things are just beginning." 6 months later, the headlines had faded. Savannah had disappeared into obscurity. Trent was facing sentencing. Madison had rebuilt her life in peace. And Noah, the man who sold his car to save a woman who betrayed him, stood beside Claire at a community fundraiser for heart patients, smiling quietly as he handed out grant checks. When asked by a journalist what inspired the foundation, Noah simply said, "Kindness isn't weakness. It's the beginning of wisdom, if you learn who deserves it." Then he walked outside, the evening sun glinting off the new Tesla parked by the curb. Not a reminder of what he'd lost, but proof of what he'd learned. Because when Savannah told him she'd rather kiss a dog than him, she thought she was ending their story. She had no idea. She'd just written the first line of his legend. He saw her one last time a year later. It wasn't planned, just one of those cruel coincidences that life throws at you after it's done watching you burn. Noah was walking out of the courthouse in downtown Atlanta, hand in hand with Claire, now his wife. They just finalized a funding grant for the Bennett Foundation, a program offering financial help to families crushed by medical debt. His story, once a wound, had become a mission. The spring air carried the smell of rain on warm pavement. Reporters lingered outside from another trial, their microphones raised like vultures waiting for a headline. That's when he saw her, Savannah. She stood near the courthouse steps, thin, pale, her once perfect hair tied back with trembling fingers. She was waiting for a bus, no makeup, no ring, no followers, just a woman who traded diamonds for silence. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. Time stretched like glass between them, fragile, transparent, full of things that couldn't be taken back. Savannah's voice broke first. "You look, different." He nodded. "I am." Her eyes filled with something like regret, but it wasn't pure. It was envy laced with memory. "Claire?" she asked softly. "You married her?" "Yes. She's beautiful." He didn't answer. Savannah tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. For what I said, what I did. You didn't deserve any of it." Noah studied her, the woman who had once been the center of his world, now reduced to a ghost haunting her own choices. "You're right," he said quietly. "I didn't." She swallowed hard. "The kids, they ask about you sometimes. They think you hate them." He looked away, pain flickering across his features. "I don't hate them. I just can't be what they thought I was." Savannah nodded, eyes glistening. "I know." A bus hissed to a stop behind her. The driver opened the doors. She hesitated, then whispered, "You really destroyed me, Noah." He turned back to her, his tone calm even. No, Savannah, you destroyed yourself. I just stopped protecting you from the truth. She opened her mouth to reply, but he was already walking away. Claire took his hand as they stepped onto the sidewalk. Savannah watched them go, her reflection flickering in the glass of the departing bus window. The woman who once mocked a poor husband, now left with nothing but her own echoes. Noah and Claire walked quietly until they reached the parking lot. A new Tesla waited by the curb, clean, silver, and gleaming in the late afternoon light. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. You okay? He nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I finally am. As they drove off, Atlanta stretched wide around them. The city where kindness had once been mistaken for weakness, where betrayal had once tried to define him, but not anymore. In the mirror, the skyline shimmered like a new beginning. Noah had learned the hardest lesson. Love built on lies will always collapse under its own weight. He didn't need revenge anymore. He'd already won. He had his peace, his purpose, and a woman who saw him not for what he'd lost, but for what he'd survived. And as the sun dipped low behind the buildings, the man who once sold his car to save a wife who betrayed him smiled for the first time in years, not because the past was gone, but because it no longer had power over him. Noah sat quietly at the edge of the fundraiser that evening, watching families file in, mothers clutching children, fathers holding hospital invoices, faces that carried the same fear he'd once known. The Bennett Foundation had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. What started as one man's heartbreak had turned into something that saved lives. The auditorium lights glowed soft gold. Claire stood on stage, speaking to the crowd with calm confidence, her voice steady and warm. When people talk about strength, she said, they picture loud victories, but sometimes the quiet ones, the people who rebuild after being broken, are the strongest among us. Noah's gaze softened. He wasn't used to hearing his story told through someone else's voice. Claire didn't mention names or betrayal or revenge. She only spoke of resilience, of learning when to walk away, of choosing peace over pride. In the front row sat Emily, his sister, tears in her eyes as she watched the man her brother had become. Beside her were 3 small children from a family the foundation had helped. The little boy's smile reminding Noah painfully of Ethan. For a fleeting moment, the ache of those lost years returned. He would always wonder what could have been if things had gone differently. But healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the echoes. When the applause faded, Claire found him at the edge of the room. She smiled softly and touched his hand. You still thinking about them? Sometimes, he admitted. Not with hate anymore. Just understanding. She nodded. That's the real victory. Outside, the city pulsed with lights. The same city that had once been his battlefield. Somewhere out there, Savannah lived quietly under a different name, far from the glitter she used to crave. Every now and then, her letters arrived. Apologies written in trembling handwriting, unsigned but unmistakably hers. He never replied, but he never threw them away either. Forgiveness wasn't something you sent back. It was something you lived. Later that night, he drove through downtown Atlanta with the windows open, letting the cool wind carry away the last shadows of the man he used to be. Streetlights flashed across the windshield like memories, fragments of pain, love, and redemption stitched together into one long road. At a red light, he glanced at the passenger seat. Claire had fallen asleep, her head resting gently against the glass. The faint reflection of the city danced across her face, and in that moment, Noah realized he'd finally built something indestructible. Not an empire, not revenge, but peace. When the light turned green, he pressed the accelerator. The Tesla hummed forward, smooth and effortless. Ahead, the road stretched open beneath the evening sky, and behind him, buried in the quiet hum of the tires, was everything he had left behind. The betrayal, the humiliation, the years of silence, now reduced to nothing more than distance. For the man who once sold his car to save a wife who said she'd rather kiss a dog than him, life had come full circle. He had sold the symbol of pride to save a heart that didn't deserve it, but in doing so, he discovered his own. And as the skyline faded into the rearview mirror, Noah smiled, not with triumph, but with truth. Because in the end, real revenge wasn't about ruining her. It was about rebuilding himself so completely that even his past couldn't recognize him anymore. Later that night, after the event ended and the crowd had gone home, Noah lingered on the empty terrace overlooking downtown Atlanta. The city glowed beneath him, a restless sea of lights and stories, each window hiding someone's version of heartbreak, betrayal, or rebirth. The wind was soft, warm against his face, carrying faint echoes of laughter from the streets below. Claire came up behind him, wrapping a shawl around his shoulders. "You disappeared," she said gently. "I was just thinking," he replied, eyes on the skyline. "About her?" He didn't lie. "A little. About everything, really." Claire stepped beside him. "You did the impossible, Noah. You turned pain into something that helps people." He nodded quiet. "There was a time I thought revenge would fix everything, that if she suffered the way I did, I'd finally be free. But when it all ended, I realized the silence after revenge isn't peace. It's emptiness." She rested her hand over his. "And now?" "Now I know peace doesn't come from what you destroy," he said softly. "It comes from what you build after the fire." They stood there together for a long while, watching the city breathe. Somewhere down there was the same hospital where Savannah's surgery had once taken place. He could still see himself sitting in that waiting room, praying for her to live. The irony wasn't lost on him, that saving her life had been the thing that would teach him how to save his own. Claire broke the silence. "What would you say to her if you ever saw her again?" He thought about it for a long moment. "Nothing cruel," he said finally. "I'd tell her thank you." "Thank you?" Claire asked, surprised. He smiled faintly. "She showed me everything I never want to become, and everything I was strong enough to rise above." The night deepened, and the lights of the city shimmered like distant stars. For the first time, Noah didn't feel anger or loss or the hollow ache of betrayal. What filled him instead was something quiet, steady, the understanding that all the broken pieces had led him exactly here. When they finally left, he drove with the windows down, the wind moving through the car like a song. Claire's laughter drifted softly beside him. The traffic lights blurred into long streaks of gold and red, like trails of the past fading into the horizon. He thought about the old Tesla he'd sold, about the rainy night he'd stood barefoot watching it disappear down the street. Back then, he'd believed that sacrifice was the price of love. Now he knew better. Sacrifice meant nothing if it was given to the wrong heart. The new Tesla purred beneath his hands, quiet and alive, a symbol not of wealth, but of balance restored. He wasn't driving away from pain anymore. He was driving toward the life he was finally ready to live. In the passenger seat, Claire reached across and squeezed his hand. "Where to?" "Home," he said, and for the first time, the word didn't feel empty. The city fell behind them, lights fading into distance. The rain began again, light, cleansing, almost tender. Noah smiled to himself, the sound of the wipers keeping rhythm with his heartbeat. He had lost everything once, his pride, his trust, his faith in love. But somewhere between the pain and the rebuilding, he'd found something rarer, peace, purpose, and a kind of strength no betrayal could ever break. He'd once been the man who sold his car to save a wife who said she'd rather kiss a dog than him. Now he was the man who rebuilt an empire of kindness on the ashes she left behind. And as the night swallowed the road ahead, Noah Bennett whispered the words that had carried him through it all. "I forgave you, not because you deserved it, but because I did." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the wide glass windows of the new Bennett Foundation headquarters. The same sunlight that used to fall on oil-stained blueprints and broken promises. Now it poured over polished desks, framed photos of smiling families, and a plaque on the wall that read, "Kindness is not weakness, it's power under control." Noah stood quietly beside it, coffee in hand, watching a group of young volunteers sort through medical grant applications. He'd built this place from the ground up, not with investors or partners, but with the same discipline that had once held his marriage together. Every corner of the building carried his signature, clean, precise, deliberate. Claire walked in, her hair pulled back, holding a folder filled with donor letters. "You should be proud," she said. "We've already helped 312 families this quarter, most of them single parents trying to start over." He smiled faintly. "Starting over? That's a language I know." She set the folder down, looking at him for a long moment. "You know what people say about you now, right?" He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "They call you the man who turned betrayal into a blueprint for hope." He laughed softly. "Sounds dramatic." "It's true," she said. "You're living proof that sometimes losing everything is how we learn what really matters." He looked out the window at the skyline of Atlanta, the same city that had once watched him fall apart. "Funny," he murmured. "This city took everything from me. Then it gave it all back, just in a different form." His phone buzzed on the desk. A new email. The sender's name froze him for a moment. Savannah Pierce. She had changed her last name back to her maiden one. He hesitated, then opened it. "Noah, I saw an article about the foundation. I don't expect you to reply. I just wanted to say that I finally understand what you meant about consequences. Everything I ran toward fell apart because it wasn't built on truth. You were always the better person, and I was too blind to see it. I hope someday our children will understand who you really were. I'm sorry, truly." Savannah Noah read it twice. There was no bitterness left in the words, only resignation, and maybe a flicker of the woman she'd been before ambition devoured her. He didn't reply. Instead, he archived the message and turned to Claire, who was watching him silently. "Everything okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, just ghosts." She stepped closer, sliding her hand into his. "Then let's leave them where they belong." He smiled, and together they walked out of the office into the sunlight. Outside, the street was alive. Buses rumbling, people laughing, the hum of new beginnings everywhere. The city no longer felt like the battlefield where he'd been humiliated. It felt like the soil where he'd rebuilt. As they crossed the street, a young boy ran up to him, maybe 10 years old, clutching a thank you card drawn in crayons. "Mr. Bennett, you paid for my mom's heart surgery. She said you saved her." Noah knelt, smiling gently. "I didn't save her, buddy. I just gave her a chance. She did the rest." The boy grinned and ran back to his mother. Claire watched the exchange, her eyes soft. "You saved more people than you'll ever know." Noah looked up at the sky, pale blue and endless. "Maybe that's the point," he said. "Life doesn't owe us fairness. It just gives us chances to be better than what hurt us." They reached the car, the silver Tesla gleaming in the sun. He opened the door for her, and as she slid in, he took one last look at the horizon. Somewhere out there, Savannah was living quietly, maybe even healing. He didn't wish her pain anymore. He didn't wish her anything at all. He learned that true power wasn't revenge. It was peace that no one could take away. As he drove through the city, Claire rested her hand on his arm. The world outside rushed past in colors of gold and silver. For a moment, Noah imagined his old life, the rainy nights, the empty driveway, the betrayal. But the memory no longer stung. It was just a page that had turned. And when he finally smiled, it wasn't the smile of a man who had won. It was the smile of a man who had survived. Because once upon a time, he sold his car to save his wife's life. And she told him she'd rather kiss a dog than him. But today, that same man drove into a future brighter than any revenge could offer, proving that even the cruelest betrayal couldn't break a heart that learned how to rebuild. Evening settled over Atlanta in a spill of amber and violet, the city humming like a living organism. From the rooftop of the Bennett Foundation, Noah watched the skyline come alive. Cranes, towers, traffic, a world forever rebuilding itself. It was strange, he thought, how cities and people shared that instinct. Collapse, rebuild, repeat. Below, the foundation's new sign caught the fading light. It bore the name of the project that had changed everything. The Bennett Heart Initiative. For a man who once thought his heart had been completely destroyed, the irony wasn't lost on him. Claire joined him at the railing, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've been up here a while," she said. "I like the view," he replied. "It reminds me how far we've come." She smiled. "When we started this place, you said you wanted to help people who'd been broken by love and debt. Now look at it. Grants, scholarships, family saved. You didn't just rebuild, Noah. You multiplied your purpose. He didn't answer right away. He was watching a man across the street helping his daughter fix a bicycle chain. The image felt familiar. Ordinary kindness, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. I used to think my story ended with her betrayal, he said quietly. But that was just the middle. The end was this. The part where I learned forgiveness isn't about freeing them. It's about freeing yourself. Claire took his hand. You forgave her, didn't you? He nodded slowly. I did, but not all at once. It came in pieces. Each time I chose not to hate, each time I chose to build instead of destroy. Down below, the street lamps flickered on, one after another, lighting the road like a path forward. For a moment, he let himself remember Savannah. Not the scandal, not the humiliation, just the laughter from the early days, the promises they'd both meant at the time. He hoped she'd found her peace too. Somewhere. Somehow. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. What happens next for us? Tomorrow, he said. We go to the children's hospital. There's a family waiting on approval for a transplant. I want to sign it myself. She smiled. Still the same man who'd sell his car for someone else's heart. He laughed softly. The difference is now I know who deserves it. They stood together until the city grew quiet. When they finally went downstairs, Noah paused in the lobby. On the wall hung a photo of the first car he'd ever owned, the silver Tesla he'd sold to save Savannah. Beneath it, a small plaque read, Some sacrifices aren't losses. They're seeds. He touched the edge of the frame, then turned off the lights and stepped outside with Claire. The night air was cool, clean, and filled with the sound of distant traffic, a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat now. No rage, no regret, just motion. As they walked toward the parking lot, he noticed a homeless man sitting near the curb, shivering under an old coat. Noah reached into his pocket and handed him a folded bill and his own jacket. The man's eyes widened. Why are you helping me, sir? Noah smiled gently. Because someone once taught me what happens when you forget how. The man whispered, God bless you. Noah simply nodded. He already did. They got into the Tesla, the city lights reflecting in the windshield like constellations. Claire turned on the radio, an old jazz song filling the silence between them. The melody was soft, full of second chances. At a red light, Noah looked over at her and said, You know, there was a time I thought revenge was the only way to feel alive again. And now, she asked, now I know peace feels better. The light turned green. The car rolled forward, smooth and quiet, merging into the pulse of the city. Behind them lay the ruins of the man who once begged for love. Ahead of them stretched the long, open road of a life rewritten. Noah Bennett, once the husband who sold his car to pay for his wife's surgery, only to be told she'd rather kiss a dog than him, was no longer the victim of that story. He was its author. And as the night deepened around him, the city whispered what he already knew in his bones. Sometimes the cruelest endings are just the universe clearing space for better beginnings. Night draped over Atlanta like a velvet curtain, the kind that turns even noise into something gentle. The Bennett Foundation building glowed softly against the skyline. Glass, steel, and purpose. Everything Noah once thought he'd never have again. From his corner office on the top floor, he looked out across the city that had watched him break and rebuild. The reflection in the window no longer looked like a man carrying pain. It looked like a man who had finally learned to live beyond it. Behind him, Claire's laughter floated through the open door. Light, effortless, the sound of peace made human. She was wrapping up a late meeting with 2 young interns, her kindness the quiet mirror to his discipline. When she finished, she came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. Still here, she said softly. He smiled. Old habit. I used to stay up worrying about what I'd lost. Now I stay up thinking about how to protect what I've built. Claire studied his face for a moment, the city lights dancing in her eyes. It's strange, she murmured, how pain makes some people bitter, but made you better. He turned to her, voice calm. Maybe it's because I stopped trying to win against her. The only person I needed to win against was the man I used to be. A notification blinked on his phone. He glanced down. Another news headline. Trent Lawson released on parole after 2 years. Former business mogul says he lost everything but learned nothing. Noah swiped it away. The story no longer sparked anything in him. No joy, no anger, not even pity. He'd already outlived all of it. He and Claire left the office together, descending the elevator in silence. On the ground floor, the security guard greeted them. "Good night, Mr. Bennett. Good night, Mrs. Bennett." Claire smiled, squeezing Noah's hand. "Good night, John." Outside, the night air was soft, and the hum of traffic carried through the streets. The Tesla sat waiting under a pool of golden streetlight. The same model, the same color, but a different story. Noah opened the door for Claire, then looked up for a long moment at the skyline. The place where his heart had shattered and been rebuilt brick by brick. He drove without music, letting the quiet say everything. The city drifted past in streaks of silver and amber. Claire leaned her head against the seat, her hand resting on his arm. "You ever think about her?" she asked gently. He didn't flinch. "Sometimes," he said, "but not the way I used to. She's just part of the map that got me here." Claire nodded, understanding perfectly. "Do you forgive her?" He took a deep breath, his eyes steady on the road ahead. "I already did. Forgiveness wasn't for her. It was the only way to stop carrying her into my future." They reached the edge of the city, a long, quiet highway lined with trees whispering in the wind. Noah slowed the car, pulling over near a small overlook where the lights of Atlanta shimmered below like a constellation of second chances. He stepped out and stood by the railing, breathing in the clean air. Somewhere in the distance, the faint wail of a siren echoed, then faded. Just another life, another story unfolding. He thought of Savannah not as the woman who'd betrayed him, but as the turning point that had forced him to grow roots in himself. She had given him the gift of losing everything, and in doing so, given him the space to build something real. Claire came to stand beside him. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That everything ends exactly how it's supposed to," he said softly. He turned toward her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You know, there was a time I thought I'd never trust again. But then you showed me that love doesn't need to be loud to be strong. It just needs to be steady." She smiled. "You found steady?" He nodded. "I found home." They stood there together, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain, the night stretching wide and kind. The road behind him was long. Betrayal, humiliation, revenge, justice. But it no longer defined him. It had simply refined him. As they drove away, the city lights grew smaller in the rearview mirror, until they looked like stars scattered across the horizon. Noah reached for Claire's hand, his voice low, filled with peace. "I used to think she broke me," he said, "but she didn't. She built the man who could survive without her." Claire smiled, eyes glistening. "Then she lost more than you ever did." He nodded, gaze fixed on the open road. The future stretched ahead, endless, unwritten, quiet. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from his past or chasing revenge. He was simply living, a man reborn from fire, driving forward into a tomorrow that was entirely his own. And as the night wind brushed against his face, Noah Bennett, once the husband who sold his car to save a wife who betrayed him, smiled into the darkness, knowing the truth every survivor eventually learns. Revenge ends the story, but healing writes a new one. Rain was falling again, the same kind of slow silver rain that had once blurred the night Noah Bennett sold his car. But now it fell against the windows of a quiet lake house far from the chaos of Atlanta, his home. The fire inside flickered gold against the wood-paneled walls, and Claire sat by the hearth, sketching designs for the new children's wing of the Bennett Heart Initiative. The smell of coffee and burning cedar filled the air. Noah stood by the window, watching the rain roll off the glass. There was a calm in his chest he hadn't felt in years, not the forced quiet of suppression, but the stillness that comes after truth, the kind that no longer needed revenge to feel alive. Claire looked up from her sketches. "You're quiet again," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Just thinking. Every time it rains like this, I remember the night I sold the car. I thought that was the lowest point of my life." She walked over to him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "And now?" He turned to her, eyes soft but certain. Now I know it was just the start of becoming who I was supposed to be. She leaned against him, following his gaze out toward the lake. The water shimmered with faint ripples, each one breaking the surface and disappearing, a quiet metaphor for the past that no longer hurt. Noah had rebuilt everything differently this time. Not with noise, not with pride, but with purpose. His foundation had expanded across states, giving grants to patients who couldn't afford surgeries. The stories were endless. A truck driver in Houston who got a heart transplant, a waitress in Charlotte whose little girl could breathe again. Each story rewrote his pain into something sacred. Every month, letters came in, thick envelopes filled with thanks. Some included photos of healed families, others folded bills from those who insisted on repaying even a fraction of the help they'd received. Noah kept every letter in a box by the window, the same window he stood at now. As the rain deepened, he reached into his pocket and unfolded a creased envelope he hadn't opened in months. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Noah, I don't expect forgiveness. I live quietly now. I work at a small clinic. Sometimes I see families like the ones you help, and I think about what you did for me, even after everything. You saved my life. I destroyed yours. Yet somehow you built something beautiful out of what I broke. I'm proud of you, even if I no longer deserve to say that. Savannah. He stared at the letter for a long moment. The pain was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding that life had done what it always did. Balance itself. Savannah had faded into her own penance. He didn't need to hate her anymore. Claire noticed the letter in his hand but didn't ask. She simply leaned her head on his shoulder. You can let it go, she whispered. I already have, he said. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the hills. Noah exhaled, then folded the letter neatly and dropped it into the fireplace. The paper curled, the ink blackening before turning to ash. For the first time, it didn't feel like erasing. It felt like releasing. Claire turned to him, her smile small but full of warmth. What do you want now, Noah? He thought about it. Not the man he'd been, not the one he'd lost, but the one who stood here now. To live, he said finally, to keep building, to keep giving. To never let bitterness rewrite my heart again. They stood together, watching the last of the letter vanish into the fire. Outside, the rain slowed, the clouds thinning to reveal the first stars peeking through. Claire reached for his hand and he held hers tightly, the way someone holds a promise they intend to keep. When the fire died down, Noah stepped onto the porch. The night smelled of rain and pine. The air was fresh, weightless. He could almost hear the faint echo of that long-ago voice. I'd rather kiss a dog than you. But it no longer cut him. It sounded distant, like a line from someone else's story. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and smiled. He had become the man no betrayal could destroy. The man who sold his car for love, was repaid with cruelty, and still chose compassion over hatred. In the distance, the city lights shimmered faintly through the rain, and for the first time Noah Bennett understood the full circle of it all. Some storms don't come to break you. They come to wash away everything that never deserved to stay. He turned to Claire, eyes reflecting the calm glow of the firelight. Let's go inside, he said softly. We've got work tomorrow. There are hearts to save. And as they stepped back into the warmth of the house, the storm outside faded into nothing but quiet rhythm. The steady heartbeat of a man who had finally learned that the greatest revenge in life isn't destruction, it's peace. Morning came slowly over the lake, a pale gold glow spreading across the rippling water. Noah Bennett stood barefoot on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand, the air crisp with the smell of pine and wet earth. Every sunrise here felt like an answer, a quiet reminder that peace doesn't come all at once. It comes in breaths, in mornings like this one, where nothing hurts anymore. Behind him, laughter drifted from inside the cabin. Claire was helping two children from the Foundation's newest family draw thank you cards. Tiny hearts sketched in crayon, crooked smiles, suns with too many rays. Their giggles filled the house the way sunlight filled the windows. Noah listened, smiling faintly. That sound, genuine, unbroken, had become his favorite music. He took a slow sip of coffee and thought about the road that had brought him here. Once, this same man had stood in the rain selling his car to save a woman who would later mock him. Once, he had begged for love from someone who only respected power. Now, he understood the truth that had taken years to learn. Kindness wasn't weakness, and silence wasn't surrender. They were just different forms of strength. Quieter, but longer lasting. Claire stepped onto the porch, barefoot like him, her hair loose, eyes bright. "You're up early again," she said softly. He smiled. "I like catching the world before it gets noisy." She leaned on the railing beside him. "You've built something rare, Noah. Most people who go through what you did never stop carrying the weight." "I did for a while," he admitted, "but carrying it doesn't change what happened. Letting it go does." She looked out at the lake, her hand finding his. "If you could talk to her now, what would you say?" He paused, thinking carefully, not out of bitterness, but honesty. "I'd tell her thank you," he said finally. "Because without her betrayal, I'd never have met the woman who showed me what love actually feels like. Without losing everything, I'd never have built what really matters." Claire smiled and kissed his shoulder. "Then maybe she did one good thing after all." "She did," he murmured. "She set me free." Inside, one of the children called out, "Mr. Bennett, Miss Claire, look!" They turned to see the little boy proudly holding up a crayon drawing. Noah standing in front of a big silver car, handing a heart to someone crying. Claire laughed. "Seems the kids are telling your story again." Noah crouched beside the boy, taking the paper gently. "You drew that?" The boy nodded. "My mom said you gave her money for her heart, so I drew you giving hearts to everyone." For a moment, Noah's throat tightened. He smiled and handed the boy his pen. "Then keep this. You're the next one who's going to help people someday." As the boy ran off to show Claire, Noah looked at the drawing again. The car, the rain, the heart. It was all there. The entire story reduced to 3 colors in a child's hand. He realized then that his life wasn't defined by what Savannah had taken, but by what he'd chosen to give, even after she did. Later that day, as he and Claire drove back into Atlanta, the city gleamed in the distance. No longer a place of pain, but of purpose. The Tesla hummed quietly over the road, sunlight flashing across its hood. Claire reached over, her fingers brushing his wrist. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He glanced at her, a soft smile forming. "That I finally understand something." "What's that?" "That love without respect is a wound," he said. "But forgiveness, that's the scar that reminds you survived." The car turned toward the hospital district, where a new banner hung over the Bennett Heart Initiative building, restoring hope, one heart at a time. Noah parked and stepped out, greeted by staff, families, volunteers, people whose lives had been changed by the work that once began in his own grief. As he shook hands and smiled for photos, he caught his reflection in the glass doors. The man looking back wasn't broken anymore. That night when they returned home, the stars shimmered over the lake like silver dust scattered across the sky. Claire sat beside him by the fire, resting her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about the day you sold that car?" she whispered. "Every time I start it," he said, smiling. "It reminds me that sometimes what feels like losing everything is just the universe clearing room for better things." He pulled her closer, the crackle of the fire filling the quiet. "I used to think revenge would make me whole," he said softly, "but peace did." Outside, the rain began again, soft, rhythmic, familiar. It no longer sounded like sorrow. It sounded like grace. And as Noah Bennett closed his eyes, he finally understood. The story that began with betrayal didn't end with revenge. It ended here, in warmth, in laughter, in love that asked for nothing back. Because the greatest justice wasn't what he did to them. It was who he became after. Morning light slid across the lake like a hand smoothing silk. Noah Bennett was already awake, standing on the dock barefoot, coffee in hand, mist curling around him. The water was so still it looked like glass. The air smelled of pine and quiet. For the first time in a long time, he didn't think about pain or betrayal or revenge. He thought about now, and how peace had a sound of its own. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Claire appeared, wrapped in a sweater, her hair tangled from sleep. She smiled, the kind of soft smile that could quiet any storm. "You always beat the sun up," she teased. He turned, smiling back. "I like to see how the day begins. It reminds me I get another one." She walked to him, the old boards creaking under her feet. The lake stretched before them, gold spilling across the surface as the first sunlight broke through the trees. Claire slid her hand into his, and for a moment they stood together in silence. Two people who'd found each other not by luck, but by survival. Noah spoke first, voice low, steady. "Do you ever think about how everything we have now started with a single choice?" She tilted her head. "You mean the foundation?" He shook his head. "No, I mean selling that car." Claire looked at him, her expression softening. "You always talk about that moment like it's where your life ended. But it wasn't, was it?" He smiled faintly. "No, it was where I learned who I was." The wind rippled across the water. Somewhere far off, a loon called. Noah's thoughts drifted, not painfully, but like watching an old movie he'd finally stopped starring in. Savannah's face flashed briefly in his mind, not as an enemy, but as a memory. A teacher he hadn't asked for. A wound that had forced him to grow a new kind of strength. Claire squeezed his hand. "You forgave her, didn't you?" "I did," he said. "Forgiving her was how I stopped being her victim." They stood watching the sunlight climb higher, dissolving the mist. Behind them, inside the cabin, the walls were lined with photos. Smiling families, heart surgery survivors, children who had written "Thank you, Mr. Bennett" in crayon. The Bennett Heart Initiative had become more than charity. It was redemption woven into action, proof that love could be rebuilt from ashes. Later that morning, they drove into the city. The Tesla's hum filled the air. The same model, the same color, but a different man behind the wheel. Atlanta rose ahead, alive and busy, no longer a battlefield but a home. On the foundation steps, volunteers waved as they arrived. Inside, the lobby buzzed with patients and families waiting for consultations. Noah moved among them like someone who understood exactly what pain looked like. Because he did. A little girl tugged at his jacket. "Mr. Bennett, are you the man who gives hearts?" she asked. He smiled and crouched to her level. "Not give," he said. "Just helps people find them again." The girl nodded seriously, then handed him a folded drawing. Two stick figures under a big red heart, one giving it to the other. He unfolded it and smiled. "It's perfect," she grinned. "That's you and your wife." When she skipped away, Claire glanced at the picture and laughed. "Looks like they got your hair right." Noah looked down at the drawing again, his throat tightening. "You know what's funny?" he said quietly. "A few years ago, I thought my story was over. I thought betrayal was the last chapter." "And now?" she asked. "Now I know it was just the beginning of the right one." That evening, after the workday ended and the city slowed to a heartbeat, they drove home through the fading light. The radio played soft jazz, and the air between them felt like everything they had fought for. Earned, not given. As they reached the lake, the last light of day turned the water into gold. Noah stepped out of the car and looked at the reflection of the cabin lights in the surface. 2 points of glow side by side. He thought about every scar, every courtroom, every sleepless night. He thought about Savannah's final letter. "You saved my life, and I ruined yours." And he realized now it wasn't true. She hadn't ruined him. She'd revealed him. He turned to Claire and said softly, "You ever wonder what the best revenge really is?" She smiled. "Tell me." He looked at her, at the peace in her eyes, the life they'd built, and whispered, "Living this well." Inside, the fire crackled. The smell of coffee returned. Rain began again, tapping gently against the windows, not as a curse but as a hymn. Noah Bennett, the man who once sold his car to save a wife who said she'd rather kiss a dog than him, now lived in a home built from grace, not grief. And as the night settled over the water, he understood the final truth of his journey. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. Because in the end, real power isn't in breaking someone else's world. It's in building yours so beautifully that even the pain that tried to destroy you ends up bowing to it. The world was quiet in a way Noah Bennett had never known. It wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of peace, the kind that lives in the air when a man has stopped fighting his past. The lake shimmered like polished glass beneath the morning sun. The reflection of the cabin danced on its surface, the wind making the ripples look like small breaths. Noah stood by the railing, the weight of a blanket draped over his shoulders, steam curling from his coffee. Inside, the faint sound of Claire's laughter mixed with the clinking of breakfast plates. This life wasn't loud. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. He thought about how strange the journey had been, how pain had dragged him to the edge, and how love had pulled him back. There was a time when he believed revenge would heal him. Now he knew that revenge only feeds the same fire that burns you. Healing was quieter, slower, but it lasted. The wind stirred. The trees along the waterline swayed. Somewhere behind him, Claire stepped outside, barefoot, carrying a folder full of letters. "You should read these," she said softly. "They're from families the foundation helped this month." He took the folder, flipping through one letter at a time. Scribbled handwriting, photos of smiling faces. A mother writing that her daughter had survived because of a grant the Bennett Heart Initiative had approved. Each letter felt like a heartbeat. Claire looked at him for a long moment. "You know, there's something about the way you read those letters," she said. "It's like you're seeing pieces of your old life stitched back together." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I am. Every time I help someone, it feels like I'm repairing something I didn't even know was broken." She set the folder down and leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about her?" He didn't hesitate. "Sometimes," he said, "but not with anger anymore. With gratitude." Claire looked up. "Gratitude? She taught me who not to be. She showed me that love without respect is just a slow kind of destruction. Without her, I wouldn't have learned what real love feels like." The words hung in the air for a while. Then Claire smiled, the kind of smile that comes from deep understanding. "Then I should probably thank her too," she whispered. They both laughed. Soft, honest, complete. Noah glanced at the lake again, sunlight splintering across the surface. "You know," he said, "for years I thought that night I sold the car was the worst moment of my life. But now I think it was the best. It broke me open. It gave me room to grow into this." Claire slipped her arms around his waist. "You turned your pain into a map, and you followed it all the way home." A pair of swans glided across the water, moving in perfect rhythm. The sight made Noah's chest tighten, not with sorrow, but with an understanding of what he'd been chasing all along. Not victory, not revenge, peace. Inside, the phone rang. It was the hospital director from their partner clinic in Chicago, calling to say another surgery had been funded, another life saved, another story rewritten. Noah listened quietly, his voice calm and steady as he said, "Yes, approve the full amount. Everyone deserves a second chance." After the call, he turned back to Claire. "It's strange, he said. "All those years I wanted justice, and now I realize I found something better." "What's that?" she asked. He looked out at the horizon, where the lake met the sky in a seamless line. "Grace." That evening, as the sun melted into the water, Noah stood on the dock again. The sky burned with colors, amber, violet, rose, reflections shifting across the lake like a painter's dream. He thought of the boy he once was, the husband who'd given everything for love, the man who'd been humiliated, betrayed, and stripped of everything he thought defined him. But now he stood taller, quieter, infinite. He whispered into the wind, not as a prayer, but as a promise. "I forgive you, Savannah. Not because you asked for it, but because I finally don't need the pain anymore." The wind carried his words across the water, where they disappeared into the last gold light of day. Claire came to stand beside him, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they'd always known how to find each other in the dark. Noah looked at her, then back at the horizon. "You know what the greatest revenge really is?" Claire smiled. "What?" He exhaled, eyes reflecting the fire in the sky. "Peace that no one can take away, a life that doesn't need to prove anything." The world was still, The water glowed, and as the final rays of sunlight vanished, Noah Bennett, the man who once sold his car to save a wife who told him she'd rather kiss a dog than him, stood at peace with his past, holding the future in his hands. Because sometimes the greatest stories don't end with destruction. They end quietly, with forgiveness, with love, and with a man finally free enough to smile again. The lake was mirror still that morning, so clear it looked like it was holding its breath. A thin ribbon of fog drifted across the water, catching the first light of dawn. Noah Bennett sat on the edge of the dock, shoes off, jeans rolled to his knees, the wood cool beneath his palms. The air smelled of pine and rain. For a long time he just listened, to the small sounds, the world waking. Behind him the cabin door opened. Claire patted out quietly, her hair in a loose braid, 2 mugs of coffee steaming in her hands. She set one beside him and lowered herself to sit at his side. They didn't speak for a while. They never needed to. When he finally did, his voice was low. "I used to hate mornings like this," he said. "Too much quiet, too much room to think." Claire turned her head. "And now? Now I know quiet isn't emptiness. It's peace filling the space where noise used to be." She smiled and leaned her shoulder into his. "You've come a long way." He nodded. "I had to lose everything to understand what everything really was." A family of ducks glided past, their wakes rippling through the reflection of the trees. The surface settled again, whole, unbroken. Watching it, Noah thought about all the years he'd spent trying to keep his life still, perfect, untouched. But still water, he'd learned, grows stale. Movement, change, was what kept it alive. Claire broke the silence. "I got another letter yesterday from that girl in Houston, the one who got her transplant. How's she doing? She drew you a picture." Claire handed him the folded page. Crayon lines, bright red hearts, a silver car, 2 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, "Thank you for helping my mom's heart." Noah stared at it for a long time. The rain, the betrayal, the courtroom. None of it seemed real anymore. Only this did. "Funny," he said softly. "I spent years trying to fix engines. Turns out I was supposed to fix hearts." Claire laughed quietly. "Looks like you're good at both." He took her hand. The simple warmth of it steadied him. "You know," he said, "I used to think forgiveness meant saying the past didn't matter. But it does. It's the reason I know what matters now." She studied his face. "Do you think she ever found peace?" He thought of Savannah, the woman who once looked at him and said she'd rather kiss a dog than him. He saw her the way he did now, not as a villain, not as a ghost, but as a lesson. "I hope she did," he said finally. "Everyone deserves one last chance to start over. Even the people who break you." Claire squeezed his hand. "Then you really have forgiven her." He smiled faintly. "I forgave her the moment I stopped needing her to understand what she lost." A breeze stirred, scattering the fog. The sunlight spilled wider, touching the tops of the trees and painting the lake gold. Noah stood and pulled Claire to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's go back inside. We've got a board meeting in 2 hours." She laughed. "You make it sound exciting." "It is," he said. "Every meeting means another family gets a second chance. That's all I ever wanted to build." As they walked back toward the cabin, he paused and looked over his shoulder one last time. The lake gleamed like a new beginning. He remembered the man he used to be, the one who sold his car to save a wife's life, who thought kindness was a weakness, who mistook endurance for love. That man had died a long time ago. The man standing here was proof that heartbreak doesn't have to harden you. It can refine you. That betrayal doesn't have to end you. It can introduce you to yourself. He smiled, the morning light catching his face. "You know what the best part is, Claire?" She turned curious. "That it finally doesn't hurt anymore." They stepped inside together. The door closed softly behind them. The sound of their laughter mingled with the smell of coffee and cedar, and outside the lake rippled once more, carrying the reflection of a man who had lost everything and found exactly what he needed. Peace. The lake was waking slowly. Mist rose from the surface like a soft veil, and the first sun painted the water in gold and silver. A heron skimmed low over the reflection, wings slicing the light. Inside the cabin, A fire murmured, and the scent of coffee drifted through the open windows. Noah Bennett stood at the edge of the dock in a sweater and jeans, hands in his pockets, eyes on the horizon. It had been 3 years since the courtroom. 3 years since the noise, the gossip, the heartbreak. The man who once couldn't breathe without the weight of betrayal had learned how to inhale again. He heard Claire before he saw her, the shuffle of slippers, the creak of the wooden floor, the quiet hum she made when she was content. She came out carrying 2 mugs. "You always beat me to the sunrise," she said. "I don't want to miss it," he replied, taking the cup from her. "The light changes so fast, it's like watching forgiveness happen in real time." She smiled, her eyes reflecting the water. "You're still a poet, Mr. Bennett," he chuckled. "I'm an engineer. I just finally learned that hearts are engines too." They sipped their coffee in silence. The world around them was slow, soft, honest. Claire slipped her arm through his. "The board called late last night. The new children's center will open next month." He nodded, a quiet satisfaction in his chest. "Then we're really doing it. Every dollar, every story, every family. It's all turning into something good." She looked at him. "Do you ever think about her?" He didn't hesitate. "Not the way I used to. I think about what she taught me. That love without respect burns out fast, and forgiveness is the only way to keep breathing afterward." Claire studied him. "That's a beautiful kind of forgiveness." He shook his head. "It's just acceptance. The past already happened. I just stopped letting it own the rest of my life." A small gust rippled the water, breaking the reflection of the sun into 1,000 moving sparks. Noah watched it, the corners of his mouth lifting. "You know, I used to think revenge was power, but the real power was walking away and building something better. Something that didn't need to prove anything." Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. "And look what you built." He looked out over the water again. The Foundation's hospital across the lake, the families they'd helped, the small miracles stitched together from what once was pain. "Yeah," he said softly. "I guess I finally made peace worth more than anger." They went back inside as the light grew stronger. The kitchen was warm, filled with the simple noise of life, pans on the stove, the distant sound of children playing on the property, birds tapping at the window. Noah set down his mug, took one last look out the window, and saw his reflection alongside Claire's in the glass. 2 people who had found each other after ruin, standing in the glow of everything they'd built. He turned to her and said quietly, "You know, there's something I never told you." The night she said those words, that she'd rather kiss a dog than me, I thought it was the end of my story. I didn't know it was the beginning of this one. Claire smiled, eyes glistening. "Sometimes the worst endings are just the universe clearing the page for the right one." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Then this must be the right one." Later that afternoon, they drove into the city for the opening of the new wing. Cameras flashed, reporters called his name, but Noah stayed quiet, humble, steady. When he finally spoke at the podium, his voice carried the weight of truth instead of anger. "I once thought saving someone meant giving everything you have," he said, "but real saving starts when you stop breaking yourself for the wrong people. This foundation exists because pain, if you let it, can become purpose. Every life we help is proof that something broken can still heal the world." Applause filled the room, but Noah barely heard it. He was looking at Claire, her proud smile steady, her hands clasped together. That was what love looked like. Not fireworks, not grand gestures, but someone standing beside you, quietly choosing you every single day. That night when they returned to the cabin, the moon rose over the lake. Noah stepped outside barefoot on the dock, the air cool and gentle. He looked at the reflection of the moonlight rippling over the water and whispered to himself, "You didn't destroy me, Savannah. You defined the man who could never be destroyed again." He closed his eyes and let the sound of the lake fill the silence, the soft rhythm of life continuing, of hearts still beating, of love reborn from ashes, because the man who once sold his car to save a wife who betrayed him had finally learned that the greatest victory isn't revenge or justice. It's peace so deep that even memory bows to it. And as the stars spread across the sky like forgiveness written in light, Noah Bennett smiled, calm, whole, and finally free. The night sky was clean, endless, the kind that made you feel small, but not lonely. The lake lay beneath it like a sheet of black glass, stars trembling in its reflection. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and rain-soaked earth. The world was utterly still, except for the faint hum of the fireplace inside the cabin. Noah Bennett stood on the porch, one hand on the wooden railing, the other wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. His life had been rebuilt piece by piece, but nights like this always reminded him how far he'd come. From the chaos, from the heartbreak, from the man who once believed love had to be earned through sacrifice. Behind him, Claire's voice floated through the open doorway, soft and steady as the night itself. "You're going to catch a cold out there," she said, coming to stand beside him. He smiled without looking at her. "You always say that." "Because you never listen." She slipped her arm around his waist, resting her head on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" He took a deep breath. The past, but not in a painful way. More like remembering the distance between who I was and who I am now. Claire tilted her head toward him. "And who are you now?" He looked out at the water, the moonlight soft on his face. "A man who finally understands that kindness isn't weakness, that forgiveness isn't surrender, and that sometimes losing everything is how you finally learn what everything really means." She smiled faintly, tracing her finger along the edge of his hand. "That's beautiful." "It's true," he said. "I used to think peace was something that came after revenge, but peace came when I stopped needing revenge." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the lake whisper against the dock. Inside, the foundation's files sat neatly stacked on the desk. New projects, new lives to be helped, new chances to give what he'd once begged for. Every family he helped was another scar turned into something living, something that breathed hope back into the world. Claire turned toward him. "Do you ever think about her?" He hesitated only a second, then nodded. "Sometimes, but not with anger, with understanding." "What would you say to her if you could?" He looked up at the stars, the same ones that had watched him break years ago. "I'd tell her thank you. She showed me who I never want to be. And because of that, I became the man I was meant to be." Claire's eyes softened. "Then you did forgive her?" He nodded slowly. "Forgiveness wasn't for her, it was for me. So I could stop reliving the moment she destroyed my trust and start living the life that moment made possible." A loon called across the lake, its cry long and low. Somewhere out in the dark, the water rippled where a fish broke the surface. The air carried the smell of smoke and wet cedar. Claire whispered, "It's strange, isn't it? How something that once nearly killed you can turn into the thing that defines your strength." He turned to her, smiling quietly. "That's how life works. The storm doesn't end you, it ends who you were, so who you're supposed to be can finally breathe." They went back inside. The fireplace cast a soft orange glow across the cabin, their shadows dancing on the wooden walls. Claire curled up on the couch, and Noah joined her, pulling a blanket over them both. The world outside was still, wrapped in calm. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You ever regret anything?" He thought about it, then shook his head. "No. Even the pain had purpose. Even the betrayal had lessons." "What did you learn?" she asked. He looked at her, the woman who had seen his scars and still stayed. That real love doesn't need to be proven. It just exists, quietly, steadily, without demands. The fire cracked, a log collapsing into embers. Claire smiled, her voice barely a whisper. "You found your peace." "I did," he said, "and that's something no betrayal can ever take." Later, when she fell asleep against his shoulder, Noah stared into the flames. The warmth wrapped around him like a heartbeat. He remembered the rain, the night he sold his car, the words that once shattered him. "I'd rather kiss a dog than you." And for the first time, he didn't feel anger or pain. He felt gratitude, because without that night, none of this, the love, the purpose, the peace, would exist. He whispered to the fire, as if speaking to time itself. I forgive you, Savannah. You didn't break me. You built me. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly on the roof, steady and calm. Noah closed his eyes, his arm around the woman who had helped him heal, and finally allowed himself to rest. Because the man who once sold his car to save his wife's life, only to be repaid with betrayal, had become something greater than the pain. He had become proof that sometimes the story doesn't end when everything falls apart. It begins when you learn how to live again. And in that quiet cabin by the lake, beneath the steady rhythm of rain and heartbeats, Noah Bennett, the man who once lost everything, smiled into the dark, knowing he had finally found everything that mattered. The lake breathed a soft mist into the morning air, every ripple glinting like glass touched by gold. The forest was hushed, dew glittering on pine needles, the faint smell of earth and rain wrapping the cabin in peace. Inside, the fireplace crackled faintly. The life Noah Bennett lived now was unrecognizable from the one he'd left behind, not because of the wealth or the new home, but because of the quiet that had finally settled inside him. He sat at the kitchen table, reading letters from families the Bennett Foundation had helped that month. His fingers traced each signature like small blessings. Thank you for saving my husband. Thank you for helping my daughter walk again. Thank you for reminding us that good people still exist. Each one was a reminder that the pain he once thought would destroy him had become the soil where something good took root. Claire walked in wearing one of his shirts, her hair still messy from sleep. You're up early again, she said, smiling as she poured coffee. Couldn't sleep, he admitted, though his voice carried no weariness. The sunrise looked too good to miss. She leaned on the counter watching him. You look peaceful, Noah, he smiled faintly. I am. For the first time, I really am. She walked over and handed him a cup. You earned it. He took it, nodding. No, I learned it. They stepped outside together, the wooden porch creaking softly beneath their feet. The air was cool and clear, the kind of air that smelled like new beginnings. Down on the dock, the reflection of the sky wavered in the still water. Perfect, fragile, alive. Noah sipped his coffee and said quietly, You know, I used to think revenge would fix everything. I thought if I just made her feel what I felt, it would balance the world. Claire tilted her head, waiting. He sighed. But revenge doesn't balance anything. It just keeps you tied to the moment that broke you. Forgiveness. That's what lets you walk away free. She studied him for a long time. You forgave her completely, didn't you? He nodded, eyes on the water. Yes, I forgave her because I realized she was just as lost as I was back then. We were both chasing something we didn't understand. She wanted power, I wanted love. Neither of us knew how to build it right. Claire smiled softly. And now you do. Now I do, he said, because love isn't about saving someone who doesn't want to be saved. It's about finding someone who doesn't need you to be anything except who you already are. They stood there a long while, letting the silence speak. The world was simple again. Just light, air, water, and two people who'd chosen peace over pride. Later that day, they drove into Atlanta for the Foundation's quarterly review. The office windows caught the morning sun, casting reflections across the marble floors. Staff members greeted him as he walked through the lobby, not with the wary glances people once gave a broken man, but with warmth and respect. On one wall hung a photograph of the first heart surgery the Foundation had ever sponsored. A little girl clutching a stuffed bear, smiling through her hospital gown. Beneath it was an inscription that read, From pain comes purpose, from loss comes light. Noah paused in front of it, his reflection merging with the child's in the glass. Claire came to stand beside him. You made this possible, she said. He shook his head. No, pain did. I just decided not to waste it. That evening, after the meetings, after the thank yous and the handshakes, they returned to the lake. The sunset stretched across the sky in streaks of fire and lavender, the world going quiet again. Noah stood by the dock, his reflection shimmering with the last light of day. Claire joined him, her hand slipping into his. You've stopped looking back, she said. He smiled. Because the past stopped chasing me. She leaned her head on his shoulder. What do you see when you think about her now? Not anger, he said softly, just distance. She was the storm that tore through my life, but without that storm, I'd never have known what calm really feels like. The water moved gently against the posts, a steady rhythm like breathing. A faint drizzle began, the air cool against their skin. Claire looked up at him, eyes glinting in the half-light. You found peace, she whispered. He nodded. And I found you. They stayed there as the rain grew heavier, laughing quietly as they ran back to the cabin. Inside, the fire glowed warm again, crackling like the heart of a new story. Noah pulled Claire close, the rain drumming softly on the roof. He whispered almost to himself, I once sold my car to save someone who didn't love me. I thought that was sacrifice. But real sacrifice is choosing to stay kind in a world that tried to make you bitter. Claire smiled up at him, eyes shining. And you did, he kissed her forehead, because if I'd let hate win, I'd still be living in her story. Now I'm writing my own. Outside, the rain eased to a gentle whisper. The lake reflected the moon, whole and unbroken. Noah Bennett closed his eyes, peace settling in his chest like a heartbeat. The man who once lost everything had discovered something far greater, that the true measure of strength isn't how loud you fight back, it's how quietly you rebuild. And as the firelight flickered against the window, the world outside rested, calm and endless, knowing that the story that began with betrayal had finally found its grace. Not in revenge, but in the kind of love that no betrayal could ever touch again. The moon was high over the lake, so bright it scattered its reflection into diamonds across the water. The trees whispered softly in the night breeze, and the air smelled of pine, earth, and rain. Noah Bennett sat at the edge of the dock with his sleeves rolled up, his feet in the cool water. The fire from the cabin flickered behind him, casting long golden ripples across the surface. This was peace, not the kind people talk about in speeches or prayers, but the kind that comes when the storm has spent every drop of its rage and you're still standing. He closed his eyes, listening to the night. Every sound was gentle now. The rhythm of the water against the dock, the distant call of a bird, the hum of a world that had forgiven itself. Behind him, the door opened, spilling warm light onto the boards. Claire's voice drifted toward him, soft and teasing. You disappear out here like a ghost every night. He smiled without turning. Maybe I'm making sure it's all real. She walked to him, her steps quiet on the wood, and sat beside him. It's real, she said, resting her head on his shoulder. You built it. For a while, neither spoke. They just sat, breathing, existing, whole. Then Noah said quietly, there was a time I didn't think I'd ever feel this again. The quiet, the safety. Claire's voice was gentle. You earned it. He shook his head. No, I forgave it into being. She looked up at him, eyes shimmering in the light. Forgave what? He took a long breath. Everything. Her. Myself. The years I wasted trying to prove love through pain. Claire reached for his hand. You never talk about her anymore. He smiled faintly. There's nothing left to say. I used to think she broke me, but all she did was remove what wasn't strong enough to stay. They sat together, the moon reflected in both their eyes. I saw her once, he said after a pause. About a year ago, downtown, she was crossing the street. She looked lost, smaller somehow. Claire's hand tightened around his. Did she see you? He nodded. Yes, we didn't speak. She just looked at me like she'd seen a ghost of the man she once knew, except he wasn't hers anymore. I think that was her closure. Claire was quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, and yours? Noah looked out over the lake. Mine came the night I stopped needing her to regret what she did. The moment I stopped replaying it in my head. That's when I realized the past had stopped owning me. The firelight from the cabin flickered across his face, catching the faintest trace of a smile. Not of triumph, but of serenity. You know, he said, there's this thing about betrayal. It teaches you more about love than loyalty ever will. Pain forces you to rebuild differently, Stronger, wiser, it strips away illusion until only truth remains. Claire's voice was a whisper. And what's your truth now? He turned toward her, eyes calm and certain. That real love doesn't demand suffering. It grows in peace. It stays steady. It never makes you feel small. She smiled, resting her head back on his shoulder. Then maybe that's what you were meant to find all along. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain over the water. The first drops began to fall. Soft, slow, rhythmic. Claire laughed quietly and tilted her face up to the sky. Rain again, she said. He looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. It's poetic, isn't it? It started with rain, and it ends with rain. She laughed, leaning into him. Not an ending, she said. Just another beginning. He nodded, and together they watched the rain spread ripples across the lake, turning every reflection into motion, as if the world itself refused to stay still. Inside, the firelight shimmered through the window. The warmth of it reached the dock, faint but real. Noah took one last look at the water, at the life he'd built from its depths, and whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't to anyone in particular. It was to everything. The pain, the loss, the lessons, the long road to this exact moment. He rose, offering his hand to Claire. She took it, her fingers warm against his. Together, they walked back toward the cabin, leaving wet footprints on the wood that the rain began to erase immediately. At the doorway, he turned back once more to the lake, his mirror, his witness, his proof. The man who once sold his car to save a wife who told him she'd rather kiss a dog than him had finally rewritten his story, not with fury, not with revenge, but with grace. And as the thunder rolled softly in the distance, Noah Bennett smiled, not because life had been kind, but because he had learned how to be kind to life. The rain fell harder, wrapping the world in its soft rhythm. Inside the cabin, laughter replaced the sound of heartbreak. And for the first time in forever, Noah Bennett no longer wondered if he'd done enough. He simply knew he had become enough. The dawn came quietly. No grand announcement, no roaring sunburst, just a soft light slipping through the curtains, touching everything it met with warmth. The world outside the cabin was still wet from last night's rain. Drops clung to pine branches like tiny jewels. The air smelled of clean earth and promise. Noah Bennett stood in the kitchen, barefoot, making breakfast. He didn't rush, didn't move like a man chasing time. For years, every morning had been about survival. Now it was about living. The coffee maker hummed. The smell of cinnamon toast drifted through the room. Behind him, the floor creaked. The familiar rhythm of Claire's footsteps. She came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, resting her chin on his shoulder. "You're up early again," she murmured. He smiled. "Old habits die hard." "Old habits," she teased, "used to include staying up until 3 a.m., rewriting financial revenge plans." He laughed softly. "Now I just rewrite grant applications." She kissed his shoulder and whispered, "You know, sometimes I still can't believe you turned your pain into all this." He turned and looked at her. The morning light caught her face. Calm, kind, real. "Pain taught me how to build differently," he said. "How to build things that don't collapse when love leaves." Outside, a pair of deer stepped out from the tree line, cautious but curious. Noah watched them for a moment, then said, "Do you remember when I used to think forgiveness was weakness?" Claire nodded. He smiled faintly. "I was wrong. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's also the only thing that made peace stay." They ate breakfast on the porch, their plates warm against the cool wood. The lake was waking up again, soft ripples, birds stitching their songs into the wind. Claire leaned her head against his shoulder. "What do you think she's doing now?" she asked gently. He didn't need to ask who. "Trying to find what she lost," he said. "Maybe she will someday. And if she doesn't," he exhaled, a quiet sigh that carried no bitterness, "then I hope she finds peace anyway. Hate keeps you tied to ghosts. I let mine go." Claire studied him. "You've really forgiven her, haven't you?" He nodded. "Forgiveness wasn't a gift to her. It was freedom for me. I stopped needing her to regret what she did. That's when she stopped owning any part of my happiness. A soft wind brushed across the lake, lifting tiny ripples of light. Claire's eyes followed them. You always talk like you're writing poetry. He smiled. Maybe I am. Maybe this is what healing sounds like. They sat there for a long time saying nothing. Just two people in a lake that had seen every version of his story. The broken one, the vengeful one, and now, the whole one. Later that day, they drove into the city. The Bennett Hart Initiative headquarters stood tall against the skyline. Glass, steel, and sunlight. The entrance was alive with families, staff, and volunteers. Inside, laughter echoed down the halls. Every wall was lined with photos of survivors. Every story a heartbeat saved from despair. In the main hall hung a plaque he hadn't seen finished until today. Claire took his hand and led him toward it. The inscription read, "Kindness is not weakness, it's strength remembered." H. Noah Bennett. He stared at it for a long moment, then he whispered, "It's strange. For so long I thought strength was about how loud you could fight. Now I know it's about how quietly you can rebuild." That evening, back at the cabin, he sat on the porch again, while the sun dropped behind the trees. Claire was inside on a video call with the hospital team. Her laughter drifted through the open door. The sound made him smile. He looked at the water, his mirror, his witness, and thought about the man he used to be, tired, wounded, desperate to make the world feel his pain. That man was gone. What remained was someone softer but stronger, someone who'd learned that revenge builds walls while forgiveness builds bridges. He whispered to the fading light, "You didn't destroy me, Savannah. You revealed me." As the stars began to appear, one by one, Noah leaned back in his chair, peace washing over him like a tide. Inside the cabin, Claire's laughter grew louder, brighter, a sound that didn't just fill the room, but filled the space inside him that used to ache. For years, he thought his story had ended the night he sold his car to save his wife's life. The night she told him she'd rather kiss a dog than him. But now he understood. That night wasn't an ending. It was a breaking open, a doorway to everything that came after. Purpose, redemption, love that didn't need to be earned. The lake shimmered under the moon, silver and still. He closed his eyes and let the quiet hold him. Because Noah Bennett had finally learned that the truest revenge is not ruin. It's peace so complete that even the past bows its head and lets you go. Morning rose like a promise. The air was crisp, washed clean by last night's rain. Mist rolled across the lake in slow ribbons, breaking into soft curls as the sunlight touched it. From the dock, the reflection of the sky looked endless, a perfect mirror of everything Noah Bennett had become. He stood barefoot at the edge of the water, his hands resting in the pockets of his linen pants, a faint smile touching his lips. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. For years, silence had been punishment. Now it was peace. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Claire stepped out, wrapped in a light robe, her hair pulled into a loose bun. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "You're always up before the world wakes." He turned and smiled. "Maybe I just like being reminded how still life can be before it starts moving again." She joined him on the dock, slipping her hand into his. Their reflections met in the water, side by side, steady and unbroken. Claire looked out at the horizon. "You ever wonder what she'd think if she saw you now?" Noah was quiet for a long time before answering. "Maybe she'd feel regret. Maybe not. But that's her burden, not mine." "You don't hate her anymore?" He shook his head. "No. Hate used to make me feel strong. I thought it gave me control, but it just kept me tethered to her long after she stopped deserving a place in my life." Claire studied him, her expression soft. "And what gave you peace?" He smiled faintly, letting go of the need for her to understand what she lost. The morning wind brushed against them, cool and light. The lake rippled gently, breaking their reflections for just a moment before smoothing over again. It was like time itself, always moving, always healing. "I used to think revenge would fix the hole she left," he continued. "But when everything fell apart, the court, the humiliation, the noise, I realized revenge just keeps you living in the same fire that burned you. Claire squeezed his hand. So what did you do instead? He looked at her, his eyes calm and clear. I started building things that would last longer than the pain, the foundation, the programs, the peace we have now. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. And you found love again. He smiled, looking down at her. The kind that doesn't need proving. They stood like that for a while, the world slowly waking around them. Birds calling, sunlight spilling through the trees, the lake turning gold. Later that day, they drove into the city. The Bennett Hart Initiative headquarters stood tall against the skyline, glass catching every shimmer of light. Inside, the lobby buzzed with movement. Volunteers, doctors, families. Every wall held a story of someone saved, someone given a second chance. As Noah walked through, he greeted people by name. He wasn't just a founder to them. He was proof that broken things could still create beauty. On one wall, a framed quote hung in silver letters, "True strength is not in what you survive, but in how you choose to live after surviving." He stopped in front of it, hands in his pockets, the faintest glimmer in his eyes. Funny, he said quietly, that the worst day of my life gave birth to this. Claire turned to him. You turned your pain into purpose. That's not funny. That's grace. When they returned home that evening, the air was cool again, the world settling into twilight. The cabin glowed softly from within, its lights reflecting on the still water. Noah stood on the porch for a long time, listening to the night, the frogs, the faint chirp of crickets, the heartbeat of nature itself. He thought of Savannah, not with anger, not even with sorrow, but with clarity. Once her betrayal had felt like an ending so final that he couldn't imagine life beyond it. But now it was simply a chapter, necessary, painful, but closed. He whispered into the night, "You didn't destroy me. You set me free." Inside, Claire called from the doorway. "You coming in?" He turned, his face warm in the soft light. "In a minute," he said. She smiled, the kind of smile that still made his heart catch. "Don't stay out too long. It's cold." He nodded, and as the door closed behind her, he looked back out at the lake one last time. The reflection staring back wasn't a man haunted by betrayal anymore. It was someone reborn through it. He breathed deeply, the air cool in his lungs, and let the final truth settle quietly in his chest. He had once sold his car to save a woman who told him she'd rather kiss a dog than him. He had been broken, humiliated, stripped bare. But from that wreckage, he had built a legacy of kindness so vast that even the pain that started it had to bow in respect. And as the first stars began to shimmer overhead, Noah Bennett smiled, not because he had forgotten the past, but because he had finally learned to live beyond it. Because the truest form of revenge was never destruction. It was peace so pure, so complete, that even memory learned to rest. The sky was velvet black when Noah stepped outside, the kind of night where every sound felt sharper. The lake stretched out before him, still as glass, stars scattered across it like broken diamonds. His breath clouded faintly in the cool air. A small sign that he was alive, not just surviving, but truly living. He walked down the dock slowly, barefoot, the old boards creaking softly beneath his weight. Behind him, warm light spilled from the cabin windows, the shadows of Claire moving inside. A record was spinning somewhere in the background, soft jazz, the kind of music that once would have made him ache, but now just made him feel still. For a long time, he simply watched the reflection of the sky. It was so calm it almost hurt. The last time he remembered looking at water like this, he'd been standing in the rain, soaked, humiliated, broken, watching the car he sold disappear down the street. Back then, the sound of thunder had been louder than his heartbeat. Now the only thing louder was peace. Claire's voice drifted from the porch, quiet and warm. "You're thinking again," he smiled without turning. "Always." She walked toward him, barefoot too, her steps as silent as the lake. She stopped beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "About her?" "No," he said after a pause. "About me. About who I was then." Claire looked out at the horizon with him. "Do you still hate him?" The man you were? He shook his head. No, he was necessary. He had to lose everything so I could learn what mattered, so I could find this. They stood in silence, their reflections long and perfect on the still water. The stars rippled slightly when Claire moved closer, slipping her hand into his. You know, she said softly, if you hadn't gone through it, we wouldn't be here. I think about that every day, Noah said. Every betrayal, every scar. It's strange, isn't it? How the things that break you also build you. She smiled faintly. That's how life teaches, not with kindness, but with clarity. Noah looked down at the water, his reflection older now, stronger, wiser. Sometimes, he said quietly, I still remember the exact words she said, the way she looked at me, the way it felt to be nothing in her eyes. And now, he said, I see it for what it was, a mirror. I was measuring my worth through someone too blind to see it. Once I stopped doing that, I stopped needing revenge. Claire brushed her thumb over his hand. You don't talk about the revenge anymore. He laughed softly, the sound quiet and sure. That's because it's finished. Revenge was just the first step. What came after? That's what mattered. The foundation, she said. The peace, he corrected. The freedom. The fact that I can stand here and not feel bitterness anymore. A light breeze stirred across the lake, scattering the stars reflected in the water. Noah watched the ripples fade until the surface smoothed again. You know what I realized? He said. Revenge ends the story. Forgiveness begins a new one. Claire leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder. And this is your new story, she whispered. He nodded. It is, and for the first time, I'm proud of the man writing it. Inside the cabin, the record finished its song. The needle clicked softly in the quiet. Claire turned toward the house, but Noah stayed a moment longer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph. Creased, faded, nearly forgotten. It was from before the betrayal, before the storm. Just a younger version of himself in Savannah, smiling in a world that no longer existed. He looked at it, not with anger, but with deep, gentle understanding. Then he folded it once, placed it in a small tin box he kept on the dock, and let it sink into the lake. The ripples spread wide, then vanished. When he turned, Claire was watching him. You let it go, she said. He smiled softly. For good this time. They walked back toward the cabin, their fingers intertwined, the night air wrapped around them, cool and tender. Inside, the fire crackled, the warmth chasing the chill from their skin. Claire sat on the couch, pulling a blanket around them both. Noah rested his head against hers, the rhythm of her breathing syncing with his own. You know, she said after a while, people would call what you did mercy. He shook his head. No, mercy is for someone else. This was freedom. I just finally stopped living inside her mistake. The fire popped softly. Outside, the rain began again. Light, rhythmic, forgiving. Noah closed his eyes, listening to the sound. Once rain had meant endings. Now it meant renewal. He had been the man who sold his car to save a wife who scorned him, the man who walked through betrayal, humiliation, and revenge. But here, in this quiet cabin by the lake, he was something else entirely. The man who had learned that the most powerful act of vengeance is happiness without apology. The fire burned lower, casting soft shadows across the room. Claire's breathing slowed beside him, her hand still resting over his heart. Noah whispered into the dark, I forgive you, Savannah. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to sleep without ghosts. Outside, the rain fell harder, cleansing, endless, new. And as Noah drifted into sleep, the storm carried his past away with it, leaving only the peace of a man who had finally learned that love, real love, isn't something you beg for. It's something you build when the wreckage is finally gone. By dawn, the rain had stopped. A thin mist hung over the lake, curling like smoke above the still water. The cabin stood in silence, the kind of deep, sacred quiet that feels earned. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, faint orange coals breathing gently in the hearth. Noah Bennett stirred awake on the couch, Claire's head resting against his chest, their fingers still intertwined. The soft crackle of dying firewood and the rhythm of her breathing filled the room. For a long moment, he simply lay there listening. To her, to the quiet, to the peace that had taken him years to find. He looked at her, his eyes soft. In her, he'd found everything his past had promised but never delivered. Kindness without agenda, love without condition, silence without emptiness. He rose carefully so as not to wake her, pulling a blanket over her shoulders before stepping outside. The porch was cool under his bare feet, the boards damp from rain. The air carried that faint sweetness only mornings after storms have. The smell of renewal. The lake stretched out before him, silver blue still as glass. He could see his reflection clearly. Older now, lined with time, but peaceful. There was a steadiness in his eyes that once wasn't there. He looked at that reflection for a long moment, and then quietly he spoke. I forgive you. The words weren't for Claire. They weren't even for Savannah. They were for himself. He sat down on the edge of the dock, watching the ripples spread outward. The memories came softly, not as wounds anymore, but as ghosts passing through. The night he sold his car, the hospital waiting room, the courtroom, the moment she looked him in the eye and said, I'd rather kiss a dog than you. He had thought that was the end of him, but that line had become his beginning. He'd built something out of that pain. Not walls, not revenge, but bridges. The Bennett Hart Initiative had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. Families he would never meet were alive because of the foundation. Children who'd been days from dying now played under hospital skylights, their laughter echoing through hallways that carried his name. Pain, he thought, was just a teacher in disguise. Behind him, the door opened softly. Claire stepped out, wrapped in the blanket he'd left her. You're up early again, she said, her voice still sleepy. He smiled. Couldn't miss this. It's too beautiful. She came to sit beside him. You always say that after it rains. Because it's always true. They watched the mist drift across the lake. For a while, neither spoke. Then Claire said quietly, I know what today is. He glanced at her, curious. 3 years since the divorce hearing, she said. 3 years since you closed that chapter. He nodded, not with pain, but peace. It feels like another lifetime, she smiled. Maybe because it was. Noah reached for her hand, his fingers warm around hers. I used to think healing meant forgetting, he said. Now I know it means remembering without pain. Claire rested her head on his shoulder. And you did that. You turned every wound into something that helped someone else. He chuckled softly. I guess life decided if I couldn't fix one heart, I'd fix 1,000. The sun broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the water. The light reflected in Claire's eyes, and for a brief, quiet second, Noah felt what he'd chased for so long. Not triumph, not revenge, but completion. He turned to her, voice low and sure. You know what the hardest part of all of it was? What? Realizing that peace doesn't arrive like justice. It doesn't announce itself. It just grows. One small choice at a time. And what choice did it start with? She asked. He smiled. Forgiveness. Every other good thing followed that. They stayed there until the light grew warm and the mist burned away. In the distance, the sound of birds filled the morning. Quiet, steady, alive. When they finally stood to go inside, Noah looked back at the lake one more time. He didn't see the man who'd been betrayed or the husband who'd been humiliated. He saw the man who had survived both and still chosen to love anyway. As they walked back toward the cabin, Claire asked, Do you ever wish it hadn't happened? That you'd never gone through any of it? He thought for a moment, then shook his head. No, because then I'd never know what this peace feels like. I'd never have learned how to love right. I'd never have become this man. She smiled, the kind of smile that came from understanding. Inside, the fireplace had gone quiet, the last ember fading into ash. Noah picked up a small framed photo from the mantel. One of him and Claire standing in front of the foundation, surrounded by families they'd helped. On the back, Claire had written, For the man who turned betrayal into a heartbeat. He set it back down gently. Outside, the light grew brighter, wrapping the world in gold. Noah Bennett took a deep breath, not the kind meant to forget the past, but to honor how far he'd come from it. He wasn't the man who sold his car to save a wife who mocked him anymore. He wasn't the man who fought to destroy his enemies or prove his worth. He was the man who rebuilt his world from the ruins, quietly, kindly, powerfully. And as the lake shimmered outside, Noah whispered to himself, with a smile that reached his eyes, "Peace is the only revenge worth keeping." The sun rose like it was painting a benediction over the water. Soft gold light spilled across the lake and bled through the trees, touching everything. The wet earth, the porch rail, the side of the cabin that had become Noah Bennett's sanctuary. The air smelled of pine and quiet. The world for once was completely still. Noah stood at the edge of the dock, coffee steaming in his hand, his reflection steady beneath him. There was no storm left in his face. The man in the water wasn't the one who had sold his car and been mocked for it, or the one who had walked through betrayal's fire. This man was calm, grounded, whole, a man who had made peace with everything that tried to undo him. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Claire stepped out, barefoot, her robe falling softly around her. "You always find the sunrise first," she said, voice still husky from sleep. He smiled, not turning. "Maybe I just like seeing what peace looks like in light." She came up beside him, wrapping her hands around his arm. Together they looked out at the horizon, a line of silver light spreading wider, brighter. "You know," Claire said, "the first time I met you I thought you were haunted, like something inside you was still burning." He nodded, remembering. "It was. I didn't know how to stop caring what she did. And now?" He looked at her, his voice gentle but sure. "Now I thank her for it. That pain built the man standing here." Claire smiled faintly. "That's forgiveness." He shook his head. "No, that's freedom." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the morning. A bird's distant call, the faint lap of water against the dock, the whisper of wind through the trees. Every sound felt sacred. "I used to think peace meant getting everything back," he said softly. "My pride, my money, my name. But it wasn't about that. Peace was learning to stop needing anyone to understand why I broke, and just deciding to live anyway." Claire rested her head on his shoulder. "You did more than live. You rebuilt." He smiled. "Maybe that's the only kind of revenge that matters. Not destruction, but creation. Turning what was meant to kill you into something that heals others." As the sun climbed higher, the mist burned away, and the lake became a perfect mirror. The reflection of the two of them standing side by side shimmered with light. For a long time, neither of them spoke, and they didn't need to. Later that day, they drove into Atlanta. The Bennett Hart Initiative's main wing gleamed under the sun, its glass facade alive with reflections. The lobby buzzed with quiet purpose. Doctors, patients, children laughing in wheelchairs. On the wall behind the reception desk hung a mural, a heart rising out of broken metal. Beneath it a plaque read, "Strength is born where love refuses to die." Noah Bennett. He stood in front of it for a moment, taking it in. Claire slipped her arm through his. "You never told me you chose that quote yourself," he smiled, "because it wasn't about me. It was about the people who taught me what strength really means." A nurse approached, handing him a small envelope. "Mr. Bennett, this came for you, from one of our old patients." He opened it, expecting a thank you letter, but instead, a familiar handwriting stared back. "Savannah's." He froze for a heartbeat, then began to read. "Noah, I know I have no right to write to you. I've spent years trying to understand the damage I caused. Not to your life, but to your spirit. I saw a man's love as weakness and didn't realize it was the rarest kind of strength. I've heard what you built. I've seen what you've become. I don't ask for forgiveness, only to say, you were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too blind to see it. I hope your peace is real. You earned it." Savannah. He folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and set it quietly on the counter. Claire watched him, searching his face. "Are you okay?" He nodded slowly. "I am, truly. Do you forgive her?" He smiled, soft, distant, genuine. "I forgave her a long time ago. I just didn't know she'd ever notice. That evening, they drove home in silence, the sky turning from gold to violet. The lake waited for them, calm as always. Noah walked down to the dock one last time before bed. He took Savannah's letter, looked at the reflection of the moon on the water, and without hesitation, let the paper fall. It drifted for a moment before sinking, vanishing into ripples that smoothed out almost instantly. He turned back toward the cabin, where Claire stood waiting in the doorway, light spilling around her like a halo. She smiled, and in that instant, Noah understood what his life had become. Not a story of loss, but of transformation. He walked toward her, and when he reached her, he said quietly, "You know what the real miracle is?" "What?" "That after everything, after betrayal, after humiliation, after the storm, I can finally say I'm grateful it happened, because it brought me here, to this peace, to you." Claire touched his cheek, her eyes glistening. "You didn't just survive, Noah. You transcended." He smiled, pulling her close. Outside, the lake caught the light of the moon, shimmering like forgiveness itself. The night was quiet except for the faint hum of crickets and the steady beating of two hearts that had learned, finally, to rest. And as the world drifted into stillness, Noah Bennett, the man who had once sold his car to save a wife who betrayed him, whispered to the darkness, not in pain, but in gratitude, "The greatest revenge is a peaceful soul." The words disappeared into the night, carried across the lake like a prayer that had already been answered. The last of the mist lifted from the lake as dawn broke, a slow, golden unveiling that made the water look almost alive. The surface rippled faintly under a soft breeze, carrying the scent of pine, rain, and wood smoke. The cabin behind him was quiet. Noah Bennett stood alone on the dock, a cup of coffee cooling between his hands, eyes fixed on the horizon. It had been years since the storm that tore his old life apart, years since that courtroom, those words, that betrayal. The wound had healed so completely that even its scar felt like part of something beautiful now. Inside, he could hear movement, Claire humming softly as she made breakfast. Her voice floated through the morning air like a song meant only for him. It was a reminder that peace wasn't always silent. It had its own melody, soft and steady, like a heartbeat. Noah smiled faintly. It had taken losing everything to understand that peace doesn't arrive wrapped in triumph. It arrives when you finally stop needing the past to make sense. Claire appeared at the door, barefoot, holding two plates. "You always wake up before the world does," she teased, her eyes gentle. He turned toward her. "Old habit," he said. "Back when I thought being awake meant being ready for a fight. And now?" He smiled. "Now I just like watching the light find its way back." She walked to him, the morning air curling through her hair. They sat on the dock, eating in silence. The world moved around them, a heron gliding across the lake, ripples widening in the golden reflection of the sky. After a while, Claire said quietly, "I had a dream about your old house last night. It was empty." He nodded. "It is. I sold it last month. I didn't need to hold on anymore." "Did it feel strange?" He shook his head. "No, it felt like closing a book I'd already finished." They sat for a while longer before Claire asked the question she always asked once a year, when the anniversary of that past life came around. If you could change it, if you could go back and stop her from ever hurting you, would you? Noah's answer came with a calm certainty. "No," he said, "because then I wouldn't know what real love feels like. I wouldn't have learned that peace isn't something someone gives you. It's something you choose." Claire smiled softly. "You're the only man I know who could say that and mean it." He looked out over the water. "That's because I've seen what hate does when you let it stay too long. It poisons you quietly until you can't tell the difference between surviving and suffering. Forgiveness was the only thing that set me free." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "And now?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Now I just try to give that freedom to others." They watched the sun climb higher, the lake turning to liquid gold. The sound of laughter carried faintly across the water. Families staying in nearby cottages, their voices full of the kind of joy Noah once thought he'd never feel again. Later that morning, they drove into the city. The Bennett Hart Initiative headquarters stood tall, sunlight spilling off the glass facade. Inside, walls were lined with photos of survivors, patients, families, all people whose stories had intersected with his foundation's work. In the lobby, a little girl broke free from her mother's hand and ran up to him, holding a crumpled drawing. "Mr. Bennett," she said breathlessly, "my mom said you fixed her heart." Noah crouched, smiling as he took the paper. It was a child's sketch, him standing beside a giant red heart, a line of people behind it. The caption read, "The man who gives hearts back." He swallowed softly. "That's beautiful," he said. The girl beamed. "My mom said you're a hero." Noah shook his head. "No, sweetheart. I just learned how to turn pain into something useful." When he straightened, Claire was watching him with quiet pride. "You still don't see it, do you?" she said. "See what?" "That you didn't just survive. You transformed." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was written all around them, in every smile, every healed life, every second chance. That night back at the lake, the air was clear, the sky full of stars. Noah stood alone for a moment on the porch, the sound of the water steady and rhythmic. Claire came to stand beside him, slipping her arm through his. He looked up at the stars and said quietly, "You know, there was a time I thought peace would come with fanfare, a day where I'd wake up and everything would feel brand new. But peace isn't loud. It's moments like this. Quiet, steady, undeniable." Claire smiled. "And now?" He turned to her, eyes soft. "Now every time the lake is still, every time I wake up and don't feel the weight of the past pressing on me, I know I won." They stood together, watching the reflection of the stars ripple across the water. Noah thought about Savannah for the last time, not with anger, not even with sorrow, but with gratitude. Her betrayal had ended one story but birthed another, one that was infinitely better. He exhaled, the words barely a whisper. "Thank you. You broke me open just enough for the light to get in." Claire leaned her head against him. "What did you say?" "Nothing," he said, smiling. "Just closing a chapter." The lake shimmered beneath the moonlight, each ripple catching a fragment of sky. Noah Bennett, the man who once sold his car to save a wife who said she'd rather kiss a dog than him, no longer lived in the echo of that moment. He lived in its redemption, and as the stars brightened above, he finally understood the truth that had taken him a lifetime to learn. Peace is not what you find after revenge. It's what you build when you stop needing it. The lake was made of light that morning, a smooth sheet of gold melting into blue. So still it felt sacred. A pair of swans drifted through the reflection, their wings leaving soft trails that shimmered in the early sun. From the porch, the smell of coffee and cedar mingled with the faint sweetness of wildflowers blooming near the waterline. Noah Bennett stepped out quietly, his hands in the pockets of his linen pants, the soft crunch of wood under his feet the only sound. The air was clean, no noise, no city hum, no ghosts left to haunt him. This place, this peace, was the life he'd built out of ashes. He paused at the railing, staring at the horizon. Years ago, he'd looked at the same kind of morning through a hospital window, holding his breath while a doctor explained what his wife needed to survive. He had sold everything then, his car, his comfort, his pride, to save her life. She had called him weak for it later, spat words that would have broken a lesser man. But not him. Not anymore. The cabin door opened softly behind him. Claire stepped out, wrapped in a gray sweater, her hair falling over her shoulders in gentle waves. She held 2 mugs, steam curling from them in the chill. "You never miss a sunrise," she said. He smiled. "It's the only thing that's never lied to me." She handed him the mug and leaned on the railing beside him. "You're thinking about her again," she said quietly, not accusing, just knowing. He nodded, not with hate, just with distance, like remembering someone else's life. Claire tilted her head. "Do you ever wish you could erase it?" He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No. If I erased it, I'd erase the lesson. And the lesson gave me this." They sipped their coffee in silence, watching the mist fade from the water. "You know," Claire said softly, "I used to think forgiveness meant letting someone get away with what they did. Noah glanced at her. And now? Now I think forgiveness just means you stop carrying what doesn't belong to you anymore. He smiled faintly. That's exactly it. A bluebird landed on the porch railing near them, fluttering its wings before taking off again. Noah followed it with his eyes. It's strange, he said. All those years I thought revenge would be the end of the pain, but revenge doesn't end anything. It just drags the wound into another lifetime. So what did end it? She asked. He turned to her, the morning light soft on his face. Choosing peace and loving again. The right way this time. Her eyes warmed. The right way? He smiled. Without conditions, without fear, without needing to prove I'm worth loving. Claire reached up, brushing her thumb across the scar at the corner of his jaw, a faint reminder of one of the darker days. You are, she said simply. He took her hand and kissed it, a small act heavy with gratitude. They stood there, watching the light dance across the lake, until the world fully woke. Later that afternoon, they drove into the city for the Bennett Hart Initiative's anniversary gala. The hall was filled with families whose lives had been saved through the foundation. People laughing, hugging, crying. There were photographs everywhere, children who'd been born healthy, parents who'd survived impossible odds. Noah walked among them quietly, shaking hands, listening. He wasn't the man who wanted recognition anymore. He was the man who'd finally learned how to build something that outlived pain. Near the end of the evening, a woman approached him, middle-aged, cautious, holding a letter. Mr. Bennett, she said softly, I was asked to deliver this to you. He took it, puzzled. When he unfolded it, his breath caught for just a second. The handwriting, delicate, familiar. Savannah. Noah, I've seen what you've done with your life. I've watched from afar, quietly, ashamed. I don't ask for forgiveness. I know I'm the reason you had to rebuild from ruin. I just wanted to say, I was wrong. You weren't weak. You were what love should have been. And if there's a heaven for second chances, I hope it looks something like your piece. He folded the letter carefully, pressing it between his palms. For a long time he said nothing. Then he smiled, faint but real. She finally saw it, he murmured. Claire touched his arm. Does it change anything? He shook his head. No, it just proves I was right to let go. That night they returned to the lake. The air was cool, the stars sharp and clear. Noah walked down to the dock alone for a moment, holding the letter. He watched the water shimmer in the moonlight, and then, with a steady hand, he tore the paper in two and let the pieces drift away. The lake swallowed them gently, the ripples fading almost instantly. He stayed there a while, eyes fixed on the moon's reflection. Full, serene, whole. Then Claire's voice called softly from the porch. You coming in? He turned, smiling. Yeah, just saying goodbye. As he walked back toward her, the light from the cabin wrapped around him, warm and golden. When he reached her, she took his face in her hands and whispered, You're free now. He nodded, his voice calm. Finally. They went inside. The fire was glowing, the room filled with soft music. Claire curled against him on the couch, and Noah looked into the flames. He thought of everything that had brought him here, the betrayal, the courtroom, the years of silence, and realized that every piece of his pain had been repurposed into light. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. I used to think survival was enough, but living, really living, that's the victory. Claire smiled against his chest. You rebuilt beautifully. He wrapped an arm around her, eyes still on the fire. I rebuilt honestly. Outside, the lake was still, the stars mirrored perfectly on its surface. Noah Bennett closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of rain and pine, and for the first time since his life had shattered, he didn't feel like a man recovering. He felt like a man reborn, because in the end, the truest revenge was never the ruin of others. It was the quiet, unshakable joy of a heart that finally knew peace. The world was quiet enough to hear the heartbeat of morning. A thin veil of mist drifted across the lake, breaking apart as sunlight filtered through the trees. The air was cool and alive with the scent of pine and rain-damp earth. Noah Bennett stood barefoot at the edge of the dock, his reflection rippling in the golden water. He wasn't the man he used to be, The one who had sold his car to pay for his wife's surgery? The man who had watched her turn that sacrifice into mockery? That version of him had died a long time ago, buried under betrayal and humiliation. What stood here now was reborn, calmer, stronger, untouchable. Behind him the cabin door opened. "You're awake early again," Claire said softly, stepping out with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her voice was the sound of peace itself. He smiled without turning. "The lake wakes me up before the world does. It's like it knows I still need the reminder." She walked to his side. "Of what?" "That no storm lasts forever." They stood together, watching the light stretch over the water. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Claire's hand slipped into his. "You've come a long way," she said quietly. "Most people never recover from the kind of betrayal you went through." He exhaled slowly. "That's because most people chase revenge, not recovery. And you?" "I chase peace," he said simply. "And for the first time in my life, I caught it." A heron glided low over the lake, its reflection tracing a silver line through the water. Noah followed it with his eyes, smiling faintly. "You know, I used to think strength meant never breaking," he said. "But real strength is what you build after you do." Claire looked at him, this man who had once walked through fire just to save someone who didn't see his worth, and saw in him the quiet nobility of survival. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked. He nodded. "Sometimes, but not with anger. Just with clarity." "What do you mean?" He turned to her, his expression calm. "She taught me everything I needed to unlearn." They both laughed softly at that, the sound carrying over the water. After breakfast, they drove into the city for the Bennett Hart Initiative's 5th anniversary celebration. The lobby buzzed with voices, families, doctors, children, people whose lives had been changed because one man turned pain into purpose. As Noah walked through the hall, people stopped him to thank him, shake his hand, tell him stories of how his foundation had saved their loved ones. Every thank you was another layer of redemption. At the main exhibit, a display featured an old photograph. Noah from years ago, standing beside the very car he once sold. The plaque beneath it read, "From what he lost, he built hope for thousands." He stood there a moment, reading the words. Claire came up beside him. "You kept that photo," she said softly. He nodded. "Because it reminds me that love and sacrifice aren't mistakes. They're just lessons in disguise." Then a young woman approached, holding a sealed envelope. "Mr. Bennett," she said nervously, "this arrived for you through the Foundation's mailroom. It's marked personal." He took it, recognizing the handwriting immediately. "Savannah." He opened it slowly. "Noah, I don't expect you to read this, but I needed to say it. I see you everywhere. On the news, in the stories people tell about the lives you've changed. You became everything I was too blind to value. I wanted the world, but you were the only part of it that ever mattered. I hope one day you'll believe that I know what I destroyed. And I hope your peace is real. Savannah." For a long time, Noah didn't move. Then with a deep breath, he folded the letter and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Claire looked at him gently. "Does it change anything?" He shook his head. "No, it just confirms what I already knew, that letting go was the right choice." That evening, they drove back to the cabin. The sun was low, casting fire across the water. Noah walked to the end of the dock, pulling the letter from his pocket. Claire stood behind him as he tore it once, twice, 3 times, and let the pieces fall. The paper drifted down like pale feathers before the lake swallowed them whole. He stayed there a while, watching the ripples fade. Then he turned to Claire. She stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his. "You're free," she whispered. "I've been free," he said. "This is just the moment I finally believe it." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and pine through the air. The lake glowed beneath the sunset, amber and quiet, as if the world itself were at peace. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled. Claire poured 2 glasses of wine and handed him one. They sat by the window, the view of the lake stretching endlessly before them. Noah looked out and said softly, "You know what I learned? That peace doesn't mean the past disappears. It just means it stopped hurting." Claire smiled. "And that's enough?" He nodded. "More than enough." As night settled in, The stars mirrored themselves in the lake, 1,000 tiny lights trembling on its surface. Noah leaned back, one arm around Claire, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a man defined by what he'd lost, but by everything he built after it. The fire burned low, the wind whispered through the trees, and in the hush of that perfect evening, Noah Bennett closed his eyes and finally understood. The greatest revenge was never destruction, nor victory, nor power. It was peace so deep that even the memory of pain had to bow before it. And beneath that quiet sky, he smiled. Because he'd won, not against her, but for himself. The world woke gently. The first light of morning spilled through the pines, catching on the dew like 1,000 tiny mirrors. The lake was still, a flawless reflection of sky and soul. The only sound was the soft hum of nature breathing, a bird's distant call, the faint lap of water against the dock, the low rustle of leaves shifting in the wind. Noah Bennett stood at the edge of it all, barefoot, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in his hands. The steam curled into the cold air, vanishing the same way pain had once done. Slowly, invisibly, completely. For a long time, he just stood there, watching the reflection of the world ripple beneath him. Peace wasn't loud. It didn't come with applause. It came like this, softly after everything else had been burned away. Behind him, the cabin door opened, letting out a spill of warm light. "You're out here again," Claire said softly, pulling her sweater tighter around her. He smiled without turning. "You make it sound like a bad habit." "It's the best one you've got," she teased, stepping onto the dock beside him. They stood together side by side, the world still half asleep around them. Claire watched his face for a moment. The calm in it, the quiet pride. "You look at peace," she said. "I am," he replied. "Finally. After everything you went through, that sounds like a miracle." He shook his head. "Not a miracle, a choice." The sunlight touched the lake fully now, turning it into gold. "You know," Noah said quietly, "there was a time I thought she took everything from me. My dignity, my trust, my family. But she didn't take anything that mattered. She just showed me what I was capable of surviving." Claire leaned her head against his shoulder. "And what did you build from it?" He smiled faintly. "Grace." They stayed there until the coffee cooled and the sun rose higher. Later that morning, they drove into the city. The Bennett Hart Initiative headquarters stood tall, glass walls reflecting the morning sky. Inside, the hum of life filled the space. Families laughing, doctors talking, children clutching teddy bears as nurses guided them through the halls. Every wall bore the proof of a man who had turned pain into purpose. Photographs of patients, plaques of honor, stories of lives saved. In the lobby, a reporter approached him for a short interview. "Mr. Bennett," she said, microphone in hand, "after everything you've endured, what does success mean to you now?" Noah looked around at the smiling faces, the gentle chaos of hope in motion. Then he said, "It means the pain was worth something." Later, when the event ended, Claire found him standing before a glass memorial wall dedicated to donors who had passed on. Above all their names, engraved in simple silver lettering, was one line: "From broken hearts, healing can grow. Noah Bennett." She slipped her hand into his. "You'll never stop giving, will you?" He smiled. "I spent years giving to people who didn't value it. Now I give to those who do. It's different when love has purpose." They drove home as the sun sank behind the trees. The world was painted in fire and quiet. When they reached the cabin, Noah stepped out of the car and walked down to the lake again, alone for a moment. The water caught the evening light, still and golden, just like the morning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded note, the last thing Savannah had ever sent. He'd kept it not as a memory, but as a lesson. "Noah, I see you in the world you've built. You turned pain into something holy. I'll never stop regretting how I failed you. You were love, and I was too blind to see it. I hope your peace is real." He read it once more, then smiled. "It is," he whispered, his voice calm. "Sure." He tore the letter gently, piece by piece, and let it fall into the lake. The ripples spread outward, catching the last light of sunset before fading into stillness. When he turned, Claire was waiting at the porch, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of the cabin lights. He walked toward her, slow and steady, the soft crunch of gravel beneath his feet. She met him halfway, eyes searching his face. "Gone?" "Gone," he said, "for good." She took his hand, and together they stood there watching the lake return to perfect calm. The world around them was silent again, but this silence wasn't empty. It was complete. Inside, the fire crackled softly, the scent of pine smoke drifting through the air. They sat together on the couch, their fingers intertwined, the flames reflecting in both their eyes. After a while, Claire said, "If you could change anything, would you?" He thought about it for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, because every wrong turn brought me here, and here is exactly where I was meant to be." She smiled, brushing her thumb across his hand. "You really did forgive her." He looked into the fire. "I had to. Peace only grows where forgiveness takes root." The wind sighed against the windows. The night pressed close around the cabin, wrapping them in its calm. Noah leaned back, his arm around Claire's shoulders, and whispered almost to himself, "You know what the greatest revenge is?" She looked up at him. "What?" He smiled softly. "Peace so deep that even your past can't disturb it." Outside, the lake mirrored the moon perfectly. Two worlds, one above and one below. Both whole, both still. Noah Bennett closed his eyes, feeling the rhythm of his own heartbeat, steady and sure. The man who once sold his car to save a wife who spat on his love had built something greater than wealth or vengeance. He had built peace, and for the first time in his life, that peace felt eternal. The morning came soft, the kind of soft that feels like forgiveness. A pale light spread across the lake, slow and steady, painting the surface in shades of gold and silver. The mist lifted in ribbons, and the quiet was complete. No wind, no rush, just stillness and breath. Noah Bennett stood at the edge of the dock barefoot, the cool wood damp beneath his feet, a mug of black coffee warming his hands. He looked out over the water the same way he used to look at his life, searching for meaning, but this time he found it in the calm. The reflection staring back at him was older now, lined, settled, peaceful. Behind him the screen door creaked open. "You'll freeze out here," Claire said gently, stepping into the dawn light, her robe wrapped loosely around her shoulders. He smiled without turning. "Not anymore. I stopped feeling the cold a long time ago." She came beside him, her voice still husky from sleep. "You've been out here since 5. Thinking again?" He took a sip of coffee, his eyes still on the horizon. "No. Remembering." She glanced at him, curious. "Her?" He nodded once. "The man I was back then. The way I let someone's cruelty define my worth." Claire reached for his arm, her touch light. "You're not that man anymore." "No," he said quietly. "That man died the day she said she'd rather kiss a dog than me. And what was left after that? Learned how to live." The wind shifted slightly, rippling the water's reflection. Claire followed his gaze. "You forgave her." He smiled faintly. "I did. I had to. Carrying hate feels like dragging your own chains. And now," he turned toward her, his eyes soft. "Now I hope she found peace too. It's the only thing I ever wanted, for both of us to stop bleeding." She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You know, that's what makes you rare. Most people stay angry forever." He shook his head. "Anger is easy. Healing takes courage." They stood in silence, watching the sun rise higher. The light caught the water and turned it to fire. Later that morning, they drove into the city. The Bennett Hart Initiative headquarters gleamed like glass and hope. Inside, laughter echoed through the atrium. Children running, parents smiling, doctors in scrubs moving with purpose. Every sound in that building was a testament to what Noah had built from pain. During the ceremony, the director announced a new project, the Savannah Wing, dedicated to supporting families of heart transplant patients. Claire had named it quietly without asking. She knew. When the applause faded, Noah stood at the podium, hands resting lightly on the sides. His voice was calm, deep, steady. I used to think strength was about holding on, he said, but I've learned it's about letting go, of anger, of blame, of the stories that no longer serve you. Pain tried to end me, but it taught me something instead. That love, real love, doesn't die in betrayal. It becomes something greater, compassion. The room was silent. Some people wiped their eyes. Others just nodded. When the event ended, he walked out into the garden behind the building. The city noise was distant here. Birds flitted between the trees, sunlight dripping through the leaves. Claire joined him a few minutes later, holding his hand. You did good, she said softly. He smiled. It's strange. For so long I wanted her to see this, to see what I became. But now I don't need that anymore. Why not? Because peace doesn't need an audience, he said simply. That evening they drove home. The sun had already slipped behind the hills, leaving behind a warm trail of amber light. The lake was waiting, still, familiar, forgiving. Noah walked down to the dock one last time, the wooden planks creaking softly beneath his feet. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was the letter Savannah had sent years earlier, her apology, her regret. He looked at it for a long moment, then tore it gently in half. The paper fluttered from his hand and drifted into the water. The lake swallowed it whole without a sound. Claire stood on the porch, watching him. It's gone, she said when he returned. He nodded. It's finally over. Her eyes shimmered in the half light. How do you feel? He smiled, slow and certain. Free. They went inside together. The fire crackled softly, painting the room in warmth. Claire curled up beside him on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder. You ever think about what you'd say to her if you saw her again? She asked quietly. Noah stared into the flames for a long time before answering. I'd tell her thank you. Thank you, Claire echoed softly. He nodded. Because she ended the man I was, the one who thought love had to be earned through pain. And in doing that, she made space for the man I became. Claire smiled, her voice barely a whisper. You've turned forgiveness into an art form. He chuckled softly. Forgiveness isn't art. It's architecture. You build it one truth at a time until you've built yourself a place you can live in again. The fire popped, a spark rising and fading into the air. Outside, the lake reflected the stars, smooth and endless. Noah Bennett leaned back, eyes closing, peace settling over him like a second skin. The man who had once been humiliated, broken, and left for dead had risen from it all. Not as a conqueror, but as a creator. He had built love. He had built purpose. He had built peace. And as the night deepened, wrapping the cabin in silver quiet, Noah whispered into the dark, not to the past, but to the present that had finally arrived. The truest revenge is a peaceful life that needs no explanation. And for the first time since that long ago storm, the world and Noah Bennett were perfectly, beautifully still.